Tell me the moment you finally gave up, and I will tell you the exact moment your life began to change. I did not believe anyone could rescue me anymore. By the time that rainy Thursday arrived, hope had become another bill I could no longer afford. My name is Claire Bennett, and at 27 years old, I had learned that life rarely fell apart all at once. It happened quietly. One overdue notice. One missed opportunity. One sleepless night after another until you woke up wondering how you had become a stranger inside your own life. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, washing gray sheets across the windows of my tiny apartment on the south side of the city. The sound should have been comforting. Instead, it made the silence inside feel even heavier. I sat at the small kitchen table with a stack of unopened envelopes spread out in front of me. Rent, utilities, hospital invoices. Every envelope seemed determined to remind me that no matter how hard I worked, I was always one step behind. The yellow light above the table flickered softly, making the room look older than it really was. I picked up another bill and sighed before placing it back onto the pile without opening it. I already knew what it would say. Across the room, my younger brother Noah was asleep on the couch beneath a faded blue blanket. His breathing was steady, peaceful, almost childlike. Watching him sleep was the only time I ever allowed myself to believe everything might be all right. He had already carried enough worry for someone his age. I refused to let him carry mine too. 3 years earlier, after we lost our parents, I promised myself he would never feel abandoned again. I kept that promise the best I could. I worked at the neighborhood library during the day, picked up extra shifts whenever possible, skipped vacations, skipped birthdays, skipped anything that cost money. Every decision revolved around making sure Noah could focus on getting healthier, instead of wondering whether we would lose our apartment. Some days I managed to convince myself I was winning. That night I finally admitted I was not. I walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Half a carton of milk. Leftover pasta. A bottle of orange juice. I smiled to myself. Noah always joked that our refrigerator looked like it belonged to people who had forgotten how grocery shopping worked. I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, listening to the rain outside. My phone buzzed on the counter. Another automated reminder about an unpaid balance. I turned the screen face down without reading the rest. It felt as though every notification carried bad news. Every phone call meant another expense. Every email demanded something I could not give. I returned to the table and opened my laptop. The pale light from the screen reflected across the unpaid bills like a spotlight exposing every failure I had tried to hide. My fingers rested above the keyboard, while dozens of thoughts fought inside my head. Pride told me to keep pretending everything was under control. Fear reminded me that pretending had not solved a single problem. I looked toward Noah again. Even in his sleep, he looked exhausted. That was enough. I opened a local community forum where neighbors shared recommendations, borrowed tools, offered rides, and sometimes helped complete strangers. I had visited the page hundreds of times but never posted anything myself. Asking for help always felt like admitting defeat. Tonight, defeat was already sitting across the table from me. I clicked inside the empty message box. For almost a full minute I stared at the blinking cursor. Then I began typing the truth. Not because I expected a miracle. Not because I thought anyone would actually care. Simply because I had finally reached the point where silence was heavier than embarrassment. The hardest part about asking for help is waiting to find out whether anyone cares enough to answer. I read every sentence twice before I pressed the button to publish my message. My finger hovered over the trackpad for another few seconds, almost hoping the internet would lose connection and save me from the embarrassment. Instead, the page refreshed, and my words appeared among hundreds of other posts from people looking for recommendations, selling old furniture, or asking about lost pets. My story looked painfully out of place. It felt too personal, too honest, too desperate. I immediately regretted posting it. I closed the laptop halfway and leaned back in my chair, listening to the steady rhythm of rain tapping against the apartment windows. Somewhere down the hallway, an old pipe rattled inside the wall, followed by the familiar hum of the heating system, trying its best to keep the building warm. Everything about the apartment felt tired. The peeling paint near the ceiling, the worn carpet beneath my feet, the coffee mug with a chipped handle sitting beside my laptop. It was not the life I had imagined when I graduated from college, but it was the life I had fought to protect ever since our parents were gone. I glanced toward the living room again. Noah shifted beneath the blanket but remained asleep. Earlier that afternoon he had smiled at me after another doctor's appointment and said, "We always figure things out, Claire." I smiled back because he needed me to believe it. The truth was, I had stopped believing it weeks ago. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I refreshed the page. Nothing. No comments. No private messages. No reactions. The blinking notification icon remained stubbornly empty. I laughed quietly at myself. What had I expected? Thousands of people posted online every day. Why would anyone stop for mine? I closed the laptop completely and carried it to the kitchen counter. My phone buzzed. My heart jumped before I even reached for it. It was another automated payment reminder. I deleted it without opening the full message. Then another notification appeared. This time it came from the community forum. Someone had replied. My pulse quickened. I opened the application immediately. The message contained only 5 words. Are you safe right now? I frowned. That was not the response I expected. No introduction. No username I recognized. No offer of money or advice. Just one simple question. I typed back before I had time to overthink it. Yes. For now. The typing indicator appeared almost instantly. Is your brother asleep? My fingers froze above the screen. I looked toward Noah. Then back at the message. Of course the stranger knew about him. I had written about Noah in my post. Still, something about the question felt unusually personal. Yes, I replied. Another pause. Then one final message appeared. Do not wake him. I stared at the screen, confused. Before I could ask why, bright headlights swept across the living room wall through the rain-soaked window. I turned instinctively. A large black sport utility vehicle rolled slowly into the apartment parking lot and stopped directly beneath the only working streetlight. The engine continued idling. My phone vibrated again. Look outside. Every muscle in my body tightened. I pulled the curtain aside just enough to see the vehicle more clearly. Dark windows, clean lines. Expensive enough to look completely out of place in our aging apartment complex. I swallowed hard as another message appeared. You are not in danger, Claire. I only came because nobody else did. My name is Ethan. The moment I realized I was no longer afraid was the exact moment curiosity became stronger than fear. I stood frozen beside the window, my phone still clutched tightly in my hand as rain rolled down the glass in uneven streams. The black sport utility vehicle remained parked beneath the streetlight, its headlights now dimmed, the engine quietly humming through the storm. Every sensible thought told me to lock the door, turn off the lights, and pretend nobody was home. Yet another part of me kept repeating the words I had just read. I only came because nobody else did. I looked toward the living room again. Noah had not moved. One arm rested outside the blanket, and the television continued filling the apartment with the soft sound of an old sitcom audience laughing somewhere far away. I envied how peacefully he slept. He still believed tomorrow would somehow be better. I wanted to believe it too. My phone vibrated once more. There was another message. Take your time. I am not leaving until I know you are all right. I read it twice. Whoever Ethan was, he was not demanding anything from me. He was waiting. That simple difference mattered more than I could explain. I slipped my phone into my sweater pocket and quietly walked toward the front door. My hand stopped on the lock. The cold metal felt heavier than it should have. I had spent years protecting Noah by refusing to trust strangers. Opening that door felt like breaking every promise I had made to myself. Still, something inside me whispered that people who wanted to hurt you rarely announced themselves with patience. I took a slow breath and unlocked the deadbolt. Cold air greeted me the moment I stepped into the hallway. The building smelled faintly of damp carpet and old paint. Rain drifted through the open entrance at the end of the corridor, carried by a steady wind that made the lights flicker overhead. I walked slowly across the wet sidewalk toward the parking lot. Water soaked through my sneakers almost immediately, but I hardly noticed. The closer I came, the larger the vehicle appeared. It looked impossibly expensive compared with everything around it. Clean, quiet, out of place. Then the driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out without reaching for an umbrella. He closed the door gently behind him and waited instead of walking toward me. That single decision eased my nerves more than he could have known. He was giving me space to choose whether to continue. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a dark sweater and tailored slacks. Rain settled across his shoulders, yet he seemed completely unconcerned by the weather. His posture was relaxed but confident, the kind that came from someone accustomed to remaining calm while everyone else hurried. His eyes finally met mine. They were sharp, observant, and surprisingly kind. Not warm exactly, but patient. As though he had learned long ago that people trusted silence more than speeches. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. The rain filled the space between us. Finally, he offered a small nod. Claire Bennett. His voice was deep and steady, carrying easily through the storm without sounding forceful. I nodded cautiously. You are Ethan. A faint smile appeared. Yes. I folded my arms against the cold. You really drove all the way here because of something I wrote online. He glanced briefly toward my apartment building before answering. Yes. Why? The question escaped before I could stop it. He looked back at me, and for the first time I noticed something behind his calm expression. Not pity. Not curiosity. Regret. Quiet, familiar regret. Because sometimes, he said softly, one unanswered message can change a person's entire life. I decided I did not want yours to become another one. The strangest thing about kindness is that it often feels more suspicious than cruelty. I searched Ethan's face for the reason he was really standing there, soaked by the rain outside an apartment building where nobody in a tailored overcoat belonged. I expected confidence. I expected arrogance. I even expected some hidden condition waiting to appear. Instead, he simply stood there, hands at his sides, giving me enough distance to walk away if I wanted. The storm filled the silence between us. Water dripped steadily from the edge of the streetlight above his vehicle, and somewhere across the parking lot, a loose sign creaked in the wind. You still have not answered my question, I finally said. Why me? Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment before looking back at me. Because you sounded like someone who had spent too long carrying everything alone. His answer caught me off guard. It was not dramatic. It was not rehearsed. It sounded painfully honest. I folded my arms tighter against the cold. There are thousands of people with problems. I know. So why stop for mine? He exhaled slowly. Because yours was not asking for money. I frowned. You were asking for hope. He continued quietly. Those are different things. I looked away, embarrassed by how accurately he had described something I had not even admitted to myself. The rain continued falling around us, soft enough now that individual drops could be heard striking the hood of his vehicle. I am sorry if I crossed a line, he said. If you want me to leave, I will. I looked back at him. Most people who offered help expected gratitude. Some expected trust. Ethan expected neither. He was giving me the choice. That alone made him different from anyone I had met in a long time. You drove all this way just to ask if I was all right. He nodded once. Yes, and if I said I was, a faint smile appeared. Then I would tell you, I am glad to hear it and drive home. I almost laughed. That sounds unbelievably simple. Life usually becomes complicated when people stop telling the truth. His words settled somewhere deep inside me. I realized I had been pretending for so long that even simple honesty felt unfamiliar. I looked toward the apartment windows above us. My brother thinks everything is going to be okay, I said quietly. I wish I believed him. Ethan followed my gaze. How old is he? 21. Does he know how much you worry? I smiled sadly. I try very hard not to let him. Ethan nodded as though he respected that answer. He is lucky to have you. I shook my head. Sometimes I wonder if he deserves someone stronger. Ethan answered immediately. Strength is not the absence of fear, Claire. It is choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. For a moment neither of us spoke. I felt tears gathering but refused to let them fall. I had promised myself years ago that I would never cry where someone else could see me. Ethan never looked away, yet somehow he also never made me feel exposed. He simply waited. The wind carried another burst of rain across the parking lot. I shivered despite myself. Without saying a word, Ethan removed his overcoat and held it toward me. You will get cold. I hesitated. What about you? Another small smile crossed his face. I have spent enough years standing in storms to know this one will pass. I accepted the coat almost reluctantly. It was warm, dry, and carried a faint scent of cedar and fresh coffee. As I slipped it over my shoulders, I realized something I had not felt in longer than I could remember. For the first time since my parents died, someone was trying to make my life easier instead of asking me to be stronger. The people who have nothing left to lose are often the hardest ones to help, because they have forgotten what trust feels like. I stood there wearing Ethan's coat, wondering why accepting a simple act of kindness felt so much heavier than carrying every burden alone. The warmth of the fabric settled around my shoulders while the rain continued falling beyond the edge of the parking lot. It had been a long time since anyone had done something for me without asking. Sometimes danger does not announce itself with loud noises. Sometimes it arrives as a feeling that someone notices long before everyone else does. I looked from the business card in my hand back to Ethan. His voice had remained calm, but something about the way he watched the empty entrance to the parking lot made my heartbeat quicken. Why would anything unusual happen? I asked. He held my gaze for a moment before answering. It probably will not. That is not very convincing. A faint smile appeared, though it never quite reached his eyes. You asked for honesty. I did. Then honestly, I prefer being cautious. The rain had become lighter, falling in a fine mist that drifted through the glow of the streetlights. The apartment complex was almost silent now. Most windows were dark, and the few that remained lit cast warm squares of light onto the wet pavement below. I slipped the business card into my sweater pocket. You still have not told me what you do for a living. Ethan looked toward his vehicle before returning his attention to me. I manage several businesses. I raised an eyebrow. That sounds like the answer someone gives when they do not want to answer. To my surprise, he laughed quietly. It was the first genuine laugh I had heard from him all evening. You are very observant. Comes with working in a library. I believe that. His smile faded into something thoughtful. People reveal more than they realize, including me. Especially you. I shook my head with a small smile. You have known me for less than an hour. Sometimes an hour is enough. His response lingered in my thoughts. It should have sounded impossible, yet nothing about Ethan felt careless. Every word seemed measured, every silence intentional. It was as though he listened not only to what people said, but also to everything they chose to leave unsaid. A cool breeze swept through the parking lot, and I wrapped my arms around myself. Ethan noticed immediately. You should go inside. You really like telling me that. Only because I would rather you be warm than stubborn. I laughed softly. That might be the nicest insult anyone has ever given me. For a brief moment, the weight I had been carrying all day seemed to lift. It was not because my problems had disappeared. The bills were still waiting upstairs. Noah would still need another doctor's appointment next week. Nothing about my life had actually changed. And yet something had. I no longer felt completely invisible. Ethan glanced toward the apartment building. Your brother is probably wondering where you are. I nodded. He worries about me almost as much as I worry about him. That sounds like family. His voice carried a quiet warmth that surprised me. Do you have family? I asked before thinking. Ethan did not answer right away. His eyes drifted toward the rain for several long seconds. I did, he finally said. There was no bitterness in his voice. Only a sadness so controlled that it almost sounded peaceful. I immediately regretted asking. I am sorry. He gave a slight nod. Thank you. Neither of us spoke after that. Some silences feel awkward. This one felt respectful. Finally, I stepped backward toward the building entrance. I should go. Ethan nodded once. Get some rest, Claire. I turned and walked across the wet pavement, resisting the urge to look back. Just before I reached the entrance, curiosity won. I glanced over my shoulder. Ethan had not gotten back into his vehicle. He was still standing exactly where I had left him, watching to make sure I reached the building safely. Only after I unlocked the front door and stepped inside did he finally walk toward the sport utility vehicle. I stood behind the hallway window for another few seconds without letting him see me. As the headlights slowly disappeared into the rainy night, I realized I could no longer remember the last time someone had waited, simply to make sure I got home safely. G for something in return. That realization made me more uncomfortable than grateful. I slowly slipped the coat from my shoulders and held it back toward him. I cannot keep this, I said quietly. Ethan looked at the coat but made no move to take it. You are cold. I will be fine. That is not the same thing. I managed a tired smile. I have been saying those words for years. I know, he replied. That is why I stopped believing them. His answer lingered between us. I lowered my eyes, unsure how someone I had met only minutes earlier could seem to understand me so well. Finally, Ethan accepted the coat and folded it neatly over one arm. He never looked disappointed. He simply respected my decision. That somehow made me trust him a little more. I appreciate what you are trying to do, I said. But I cannot let a stranger solve my life. Ethan nodded once. I never intended to. I frowned. Then why are you here? Because sometimes people do not need someone to fix their problems. They need proof that they are not invisible. The words settled deep inside me. Invisible. That was exactly how I had felt for months. Working, paying bills, waiting in hospital corridors, smiling for Noah, pretending everything was under control while the rest of the world hurried past without noticing. I looked toward the apartment building again. A single window across the courtyard glowed with warm light. Somewhere above us, a baby cried briefly before the sound faded into the rain. Life continued around us, ordinary and unaware. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a simple business card. It was plain white with only his name and a phone number printed in black lettering. No company logo, no job title, nothing else. He held it toward me. I hesitated before taking it. "If tomorrow feels easier," he said, "throw it away." I looked at the card. "And if it does not, call me before things become impossible." I almost laughed. "You make it sound very simple." "It is simple." His voice remained calm. "The difficult part is deciding you deserve help." My fingers tightened around the card. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I had survived on my own for years, that asking for help made people dependent. Yet none of those arguments felt convincing anymore. Not after tonight. "You still do not know anything about me," I whispered. Ethan looked at me with the same quiet patience he had shown since we met. "I know enough." "How?" He glanced toward the apartment windows where Noah slept peacefully above us. "Because people who spend their last bit of strength protecting someone else rarely ask for help unless they truly need it." I felt my throat tighten. Before I could answer, his phone vibrated briefly. He glanced at the screen for less than a second before slipping it back into his pocket. His expression did not change, but his eyes shifted almost instinctively toward the entrance of the parking lot. I followed his gaze. A dark sedan rolled slowly past without stopping, its headlights reflecting across the rain-soaked pavement before disappearing around the corner. Ethan watched until the taillights vanished. Then he looked back at me, his calm expression returning almost immediately. "Claire," he said softly, "when you go upstairs tonight, lock your door. And if anything feels unusual, even if it seems small, promise me you will call the number on that card." Sometimes hope returns so quietly that you do not realize your life has already begun changing until someone else points it out. The apartment was warm when I stepped inside, carrying with me the faint scent of rain and cedar that still lingered from Ethan's coat. I locked the door exactly as he had asked and stood there for a moment with my hand resting on the deadbolt. His business card remained safely tucked inside my sweater pocket. I told myself I was keeping it only to be polite. Deep down, I knew that was not the truth. I walked into the living room as quietly as I could, but Noah was already awake. He pushed himself upright on the couch, rubbing one eye before looking at me with the familiar expression only younger brothers seem capable of wearing. Equal parts concern and curiosity. "You disappeared," he said with a sleepy smile. "I was starting to think the rain had carried you away." I laughed softly, setting my keys on the small table by the door. "It almost did." He studied me for a second longer. "You look different." I frowned. "Different how?" "Less tired." The answer came so quickly that I knew he had not been trying to be funny. He was simply telling the truth. I sat beside him on the couch and reached over to straighten the blanket that had slipped to the floor. "I met someone tonight." Noah raised one eyebrow. "That sounds interesting." It was unexpected. Unexpected usually is interesting. I smiled despite myself. Noah had always been able to find lightness in situations that felt impossibly heavy to me. Maybe that was why I fought so hard to protect his optimism. I wanted him to keep believing the world could still surprise people in good ways. "Who is he?" Noah asked. I hesitated. It suddenly occurred to me that I knew almost nothing about Ethan. Just his first and last name, a phone number, a pair of patient eyes. "I honestly do not know," I admitted. Noah laughed. "Claire, that is probably the most mysterious thing you have ever said." He answered the message I posted. Noah's smile faded into quiet understanding. "Someone actually came." I nodded. "He drove across the city just to make sure we were okay." Noah leaned back against the couch cushion, clearly surprised. "People really do that?" I looked toward the rain-covered window. "Apparently one person does." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The old refrigerator hummed quietly from the kitchen while rain tapped gently against the glass. It no longer sounded lonely. It sounded peaceful. Noah finally looked at me again. "Do you trust him?" The question settled heavily between us. I thought about Ethan standing in the rain without stepping closer than necessary. I thought about him waiting until I reached the building before leaving. I thought about the way he never once made me feel like I owed him anything. "I do not know if I trust him yet," I answered honestly. but I believe he meant everything he said. Noah smiled. That is a good place to start. I nodded slowly. Before heading to bed, I reached into my pocket and looked at the simple white business card one more time. It still seemed impossible that a stranger had crossed the city because of a message almost nobody else had noticed. As I placed the card carefully inside the drawer beside my bed, I caught myself doing something I had not done in months. I set an alarm for tomorrow without wondering whether the next day would simply bring another reason to give up. The people who change your life rarely do it all at once. Most of the time, they simply refuse to disappear when everyone else already has. The next morning the rain had finally stopped, leaving the city washed clean beneath a pale gray sky. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in thin golden lines that stretched across the living room floor. I woke earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because my mind refused to stop replaying the previous night. Ethan's face. His quiet voice. The business card resting inside the drawer beside my bed. For the first time in weeks, I did not wake with the familiar knot of panic already waiting in my chest. It had not disappeared completely, but it had loosened just enough for me to breathe. Noah was already in the kitchen attempting to make breakfast. The smell of slightly overcooked toast drifted. The smallest moments often become the ones you remember forever, because you do not realize they are the beginning of something much bigger. By the time my shift finally ended, the afternoon sky had turned a soft shade of orange, and the streets outside the library glowed beneath the fading light. I gathered my bag, said goodbye to my coworkers, and stepped onto the sidewalk. The cool air carried the scent of autumn leaves and fresh coffee from the cafe across the street. For a brief moment, I forgot about unpaid bills, hospital appointments, and every worry that had kept me awake the night before. Then I noticed the dark sedan again. It was parked in almost the exact same place where I had seen it during lunch. Maybe it had left and returned. Maybe it had never moved at all. I told myself there were perfectly ordinary explanations. Someone could have been waiting for a family member. A driver might have been taking a break between rides. The city was full of strangers. Not every stranger had a story connected to mine. I started walking toward the bus stop, trying not to look in that direction again. My phone buzzed inside my bag. I smiled automatically, expecting another reminder from the pharmacy or another unpaid invoice. Instead, the screen displayed an unfamiliar number. For a second, I considered ignoring it, but something made me answer. Hello? There was silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of someone deciding what to say, but the quiet sound of an open phone line with nobody speaking. Hello? I repeated. After another few seconds, the call disconnected. I stared at the screen, puzzled. No voicemail. No message. Just an unknown number that had disappeared as quickly as it arrived. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and continued walking. The strange feeling from earlier returned, settling somewhere deep in my chest. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Stress had a way of turning ordinary events into imagined warnings. Even so, I found myself glancing toward the opposite side of the street again. The sedan was gone. I let out a quiet breath I had not realized I was holding. When I arrived home, Noah was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 bowls of soup waiting for us. He looked up with the same warm smile he always managed to find, no matter how difficult things became. Long day? He asked. Not as long as yesterday. He nodded knowingly. I liked that answer better. We ate dinner together while talking about books, neighbors, and the terrible weather forecast for the weekend. I almost mentioned Ethan more than once, but stopped myself each time. Somehow it felt too personal, as though speaking his name aloud might make the previous night seem less real. After dinner, Noah carried the dishes into the kitchen while I sorted through the mail that had been slipped beneath our door. Advertisements, utility notices, a grocery coupon. Then I noticed a plain white envelope with no return address. My name was written neatly across the front. Nothing else. I frowned and carefully opened it. Inside was a single blank sheet of paper. No message. No signature. No explanation. Just one empty page. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the evening air. At that exact moment, someone knocked softly on the apartment door. Noah looked toward me from the kitchen. Are you expecting anyone? I slowly folded the blank paper and shook my head. Then, through the peephole, I saw a man I had never met before standing quietly in the hallway, and the first words out of his mouth made my heart stop. Good evening, he said politely. I was hoping you could answer a few questions about Claire Bennett through the apartment. You are smiling again, he said without even turning around. I am not. He looked over his shoulder with an amused grin. You definitely are. I reached for a mug and poured myself a cup of coffee. Maybe I just slept better. Or maybe mysterious strangers are good for your mood. I rolled my eyes while trying not to laugh. You watch too many movies, and you spend too much time pretending everything is fine. His words landed gently because they were true. We ate breakfast together while talking about ordinary things. His next doctor's appointment. A new mystery novel that had just arrived at the library. Whether the old washing machine downstairs would finally stop making sounds like it wanted to retire. For 20 peaceful minutes, our lives felt almost normal. That feeling stayed with me all the way to work. The neighborhood library smelled exactly as it always did. A comforting mixture of old paper, polished wood, and fresh coffee drifting from the small cafe across the street. I greeted regular visitors, helped an elderly couple find a travel guide, and shelved returned books one cart at a time. Every few minutes, I caught myself touching the pocket of my cardigan before remembering the business card was safely back at home. The habit made me smile despite myself. Around lunchtime, I stepped outside with a sandwich and sat on a bench beneath a maple tree. The cool autumn air carried the scent of damp leaves across the sidewalk. People hurried past carrying briefcases, shopping bags, and steaming coffee cups. Everyone seemed focused on somewhere else they needed to be. I wondered where Ethan was at that exact moment. Somehow I could not imagine him sitting behind an ordinary office desk. Before I could stop myself, I laughed quietly at the thought. It was ridiculous. I barely knew the man, yet he had occupied my thoughts since the moment I met him. As I stood to head back inside, something caught my attention across the street. A dark sedan was parked near the curb with its engine running. It might have meant nothing. Cars parked there every day. But something about it felt strangely familiar. I frowned for a second before shaking the feeling away. Stress had a way of making ordinary things seem suspicious. I walked back into the library, reminding myself that not every coincidence carried a hidden meaning. Still, as I disappeared between the tall bookshelves, the sedan remained exactly where it was, quiet and motionless beneath the afternoon sun. End of episode 1. One message changed everything, but the truth has only begun. Episode 2 premieres soon. I used to believe that unanswered questions were the hardest things to live with. I was wrong. The hardest thing is realizing that someone may already know the answers but is trying to protect you from them. The knock came again, just as calm and deliberate as the first. Noah stepped closer to me, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. I folded the blank sheet of paper and slipped it back into the envelope before taking another careful look through the peephole. The man standing in the hallway appeared to be in his late 50s. He wore a navy raincoat despite the clear evening, carried a leather folder beneath one arm, and waited with remarkable patience. He did not look threatening. If anything, he looked like an accountant or an insurance representative. That almost made me more uneasy. I unlocked the door but left the security chain in place before opening it a few inches. "Can I help you?" I asked. The man offered a polite smile. "Good evening. I apologize for disturbing you. I am trying to verify a few pieces of information." "About what?" "About someone named Claire Bennett." My heart skipped once. "Who are you?" His smile remained unchanged. "My name is Richard Collins." He reached slowly into his pocket and produced a business card before holding it where I could read it through the narrow opening. There was a name. A phone number. Nothing more. No company. No title. "Who sent you?" I asked. "I am afraid I cannot discuss that." "Then I cannot help you." He nodded as though he had expected that answer. "That is understandable." His calmness unsettled me more than an argument would have. He glanced briefly toward the hallway windows before looking back at me. "May I ask one simple question?" I hesitated but said nothing. "Have you recently met someone named Ethan Moretti?" Every sound inside the apartment seemed to disappear. I kept my expression as steady as I could. "I do not know anyone by that name." Richard studied my face for only a second before giving another courteous nod. "Thank you for your time, Miss Bennett. If you remember anything, please call the number on the card." He placed it gently on the floor outside my door, stepped backward, and walked away without another word. I waited until the elevator doors closed before removing the security chain and picking up the card. Noah immediately looked at me. "Who was that?" I stared at the card for a long moment. "I honestly do not know, but he knew Ethan." I nodded slowly. "Apparently." Noah frowned. Do you think you should call Ethan? The question echoed inside my mind. I looked toward the drawer beside my bed, where Ethan's card rested exactly where I had left it. Less than 24 hours earlier, he had told me that if anything unusual happened, I should call him. At the time, I thought he was simply being careful. Now I was no longer sure. Before I could decide, my phone vibrated. An unknown number appeared on the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it ring. Instead, I answered. Hello. A familiar voice spoke immediately, calm and composed. Claire, this is Ethan. Relief washed over me before confusion quickly replaced it. How did you know to call? There was a brief pause on the other end, because someone has been asking questions about you all evening, and I need to make sure you and Noah are safe. My grip tightened around the phone. Ethan, who exactly are you? The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but somehow it felt long enough to change everything. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the quiet hum of the apartment refrigerator behind me and the distant sound of an elevator somewhere down the hallway. On the other end of the line, Ethan's breathing remained slow and controlled, as though he were choosing every word before allowing it to leave his mouth. Claire, he finally said, there are things I cannot explain over the phone. I looked toward Noah, who was watching me from across the room with growing concern. You knew someone was asking about me before I did, I replied. That is not a coincidence. Another brief silence followed. No, Ethan admitted. It is not. My heartbeat quickened. Then tell me what is happening. I will, he answered calmly. But first I need to know whether the man who came to your apartment is gone. I walked carefully toward the peephole and looked into the hallway again. It was empty. The business card Richard Collins had left was still resting on the small table beside the door where I had placed it. He left several minutes ago. Did he threaten you? No. Did he touch either of you? No. Did he ask about anyone besides me? I frowned. Noah was standing beside me the entire time. He ignored him completely. Ethan exhaled softly, almost as though that answer had confirmed something important. Good, good, I repeated. How can any of this possibly be good? Because it means they are still gathering information instead of making decisions. His choice of words unsettled me. Who are they? I asked. And why do you keep saying they? Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, I heard what sounded like a car door closing somewhere near him, followed by the quiet murmur of another voice too distant to understand. Are you with someone? I asked. Yes. Who? People I trust. My mind raced through every possibility. Nothing about this conversation felt normal anymore. Less than 2 days ago, I had been worried about overdue bills and grocery money. Now a stranger had appeared at my apartment asking about Ethan, and Ethan somehow seemed to know what was happening before I did. Claire, he continued, I need you to listen carefully. Until we understand why someone is looking for you, do not tell anyone about me. Anyone. Anyone. I glanced at Noah again. He was pretending not to listen, but I knew he could hear every word. You are asking me to trust you while refusing to explain anything. I know. That is not fair. No, Ethan said quietly. It is not. There was no defensiveness in his voice, only honesty. Somehow that made it even harder to stay angry. Then give me one reason, I whispered. Just one reason why I should believe you. The answer came without hesitation. Because if I wanted to deceive you, I would never have warned you that someone was coming. I closed my eyes for a second. He was right. He could have said nothing. He could have let Richard Collins arrive without warning. Instead, he had called before I even reached for his business card. Noah stepped closer and spoke softly enough that only I could hear. Claire, whoever he is, he sounds more worried about us than himself. I looked back at the phone. What happens now? Ethan replied in the same calm voice that had first reached me through a simple online message. Tomorrow morning, go to work exactly as you normally would. Live your day as if nothing has changed. And you? I asked. I am going to find out why a man using the name Richard Collins suddenly became interested in Claire Bennett. Before I could ask another question, another voice spoke clearly from Ethan's side of the call. Sir, we found the vehicle. The line went silent for a fraction of a second. Ethan lowered his voice. Claire, I have to go. Keep your phone with you, and if anything feels wrong, call me immediately. The call ended before I could respond. I stared at the dark screen in my hand, unable to move. One single word echoed through my mind louder than everything else I had heard that night. Sir, sleep never came that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the stranger politely asking about me, followed by the quiet voice that had slipped through Ethan's phone. Sir. One simple word had shattered the ordinary picture I had been trying to build of him. By sunrise, I had convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Plenty of successful people had assistants. Plenty of business owners had employees who addressed them formally. I repeated those thoughts while making coffee, hoping one of them would finally sound convincing. Noah wandered into the kitchen, wearing an old college sweatshirt, and rubbed the sleep from his eyes. You look like you got about 2 hours of sleep, he said. That obvious? He smiled gently. Only because I know you. I poured coffee into 2 mugs before sitting across from him. Neither of us mentioned the man from the previous evening at first. Instead, we talked about breakfast, the weather, and his upcoming doctor's appointment. It almost felt normal until Noah finally looked at me over the rim of his mug. Are you going to tell me what you are thinking? I stared at the steam rising from my coffee. I think I accidentally stepped into someone else's story. Noah frowned. Meaning? Nothing about Ethan makes sense anymore. Noah leaned back in his chair. Maybe he was trying to protect you. From what? That is exactly what you need to find out. His answer stayed with me long after I left the apartment. The morning air was crisp, carrying the smell of wet pavement left behind by yesterday's rain. As I walked toward the bus stop, I caught myself looking over my shoulder more than once. Every parked vehicle suddenly seemed suspicious. Every unfamiliar face held my attention a little longer than it should have. Stress was changing the way I saw the world. When I reached the library, the familiar routines helped steady my thoughts. Returned books needed shelving. Children gathered near the reading corner for story time. An elderly regular waved as he entered carrying the same newspaper he brought every Thursday. For almost 2 hours, life returned to normal. Then my manager asked me to deliver a stack of donated books to a historical society 2 blocks away. I carried the box outside and walked slowly toward the old brick building. As I reached the entrance, the front doors opened before I could touch them. 2 men in dark suits stepped outside first. Neither looked at me. Instead, they turned slightly toward the doorway behind them, almost instinctively making space. A third man emerged. Ethan. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, with no overcoat this time. The moment he appeared, conversations near the entrance seemed to pause. An older gentleman wearing an expensive tailored jacket walked forward immediately and extended his hand with obvious respect. Good morning, Mr. Moretti, he said warmly. Thank you for coming. Ethan shook his hand politely. The pleasure is mine. Another man approached carrying a folder. Sir, the meeting room is ready. There it was again. Sir. Not forced. Not exaggerated. Natural. Familiar. The people around him were not simply being polite. They were waiting for him. Listening to him. Respecting him without question. Ethan turned slightly, and for the first time he noticed me standing on the sidewalk holding a box of books. Surprise crossed his face for only a fraction of a second before his usual calm expression returned. For reasons I could not explain, I suddenly felt as though I had discovered a chapter of his life he had never intended me to read. There are moments when the truth does not arrive as a confession. It arrives as a single look that tells you someone has been hiding an entire world from you. Ethan's eyes met mine across the sidewalk, and for a brief second the noise of the city seemed to disappear. The older gentleman beside him was still speaking. The man holding the folder was waiting patiently, and the 2 men near the entrance remained quietly alert. Yet Ethan's attention rested entirely on me. He excused himself with a polite nod to the group and walked toward me without hesitation. The others did not question his decision. They simply stepped back, almost instinctively, allowing him to pass. I tightened my grip on the box of donated books, suddenly feeling underdressed in my library cardigan and comfortable shoes. Claire, Ethan said gently after reaching me. I was not expecting to see you here. Apparently neither was I. He glanced at the heavy box in my arms. May I? Before I could answer, he lifted it effortlessly. The gesture was so natural that I barely had time to object. You do not have to carry that, I said. I know. His answer came with the same quiet certainty I had already begun recognizing. I want to. We walked together toward the entrance of the Historical Society building. I could feel curious eyes following us, but no one interrupted. When we reached the front steps, Ethan handed the box back just before we entered, careful not to make it appear as though he had taken over my responsibility. It was a small detail, yet somehow it revealed how thoughtful he was. Inside the lobby, volunteers smiled politely while accepting the donation. I completed the paperwork as quickly as possible, but my thoughts remained fixed on what I had witnessed outside. The respect people showed Ethan was impossible to ignore. As we stepped back onto the sidewalk, I finally asked the question that had been growing inside me since the previous evening. Who are you really? Ethan looked toward the passing traffic before answering. I told you the truth. You told me you managed businesses. I do. People do not call ordinary business owners sir like that. He smiled faintly. Some do. I folded my arms. You are avoiding the question. Yes. At least he admitted it. That honesty somehow made the conversation even more frustrating. Why? I asked quietly. Because the answer would change the way you see me before you have the chance to know me. I searched his face for any sign that he was joking. There was none. Should it? He was silent for several seconds. I hope not. A black sedan pulled smoothly to the curb beside us. This one was different from the vehicle I had seen near the library. A man stepped out from the driver's seat and opened the rear passenger door without saying a word. He wore a dark suit and greeted Ethan with a respectful nod. Sir, everyone is waiting. Ethan glanced toward the car, then back at me. For the first time since we met, he looked genuinely reluctant to leave. I have a meeting, he said. Clearly. I replied with a small smile that did little to hide my confusion. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. My direct number. I looked at it. You already gave me your number. That one reaches me. He paused. This one reaches only me. Before I could ask what that meant, the driver quietly closed the rear door and waited beside the vehicle with remarkable patience. Ethan stepped backward. Please be careful on your way home today. Ethan. He stopped. One day, I said, I think you are going to have to tell me the truth. He held my gaze with a sadness I had only seen once before, standing in the rain outside my apartment. One day, he answered softly, I hope I still have the chance. I always thought secrets were hidden behind locked doors. I never imagined they could be hidden behind acts of kindness. I stood on the sidewalk long after Ethan's car disappeared into afternoon traffic, the folded piece of paper still resting in my hand. Unlike the first business card he had given me, this one contained nothing except a handwritten phone number. No name, no address, no explanation. I slipped it carefully into my wallet before returning to the library, but my thoughts never truly returned with me. Every conversation with a visitor faded into the background. Every book I shelved found its place almost automatically while my mind replayed the same moments again and again. The respectful greetings, the waiting driver, the quiet confidence that seemed to surround Ethan wherever he went. None of it matched the image of the man who had stood in the rain outside my apartment, simply to make sure I was safe. Near the end of my shift, my manager asked if I could stop by a neighborhood pharmacy on my way home to pick up a donated collection of children's books. I agreed without hesitation. The pharmacy was only a few blocks away, and I planned to pick up Noah's prescription while I was there. The familiar routine helped calm my thoughts, at least until I stepped outside. As I reached the corner, I noticed the same dark sedan parked across the street again. This time I did not dismiss it as coincidence. The driver remained inside with both hands resting on the steering wheel. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see clearly, but I could not shake the feeling that someone inside was watching the sidewalk rather than the traffic. I kept walking without changing my pace. Maybe Ethan had been right. Maybe being cautious was different from being afraid. After leaving the pharmacy with Noah's medication and the small box of donated books, I decided to take a different route home. It added nearly 10 minutes to the walk, but curiosity told me to see whether the sedan would still be there. Halfway down the next block, I glanced into the reflection of a storefront window. A dark vehicle turned the same corner I had just crossed. My heartbeat quickened. It stayed several car lengths behind me, moving no faster than the flow of traffic. I told myself there could be dozens of innocent explanations, yet I reached into my wallet almost without thinking and touched the folded paper Ethan had given me. I did not call. Not yet. Instead, I entered a crowded neighborhood coffee shop and stood in line with several other customers. Through the front window, I watched the sedan continue past the intersection before disappearing around the corner. Relief spread through me, followed almost immediately by embarrassment. Perhaps I had imagined the entire thing. Perhaps anxiety had simply begun filling every quiet space in my mind. I ordered a cup of coffee and found a seat near the window, determined to slow my breathing before walking home. A few minutes later, the chair across from me moved. I looked up, expecting another customer searching for an empty seat. Instead, Ethan stood there holding his own cup of coffee. He looked at me for a long second before speaking. "I was hoping you would choose a public place instead of walking home alone." I stared at him in disbelief. "Were you following me?" Ethan's expression remained calm, but there was something heavier behind his eyes than I had ever seen before. "No, Claire," he answered quietly. "I was following the people who were following you." The truth has a strange way of arriving one sentence at a time until suddenly there is no room left for denial. I stared at Ethan across the small coffee shop table, searching his face for any sign that he was exaggerating. There was none. Around us, people chatted quietly over steaming cups, laptops glowed beneath warm hanging lights, and soft jazz drifted through the room as though this were an ordinary afternoon. Somehow that ordinary setting made his words feel even more unsettling. "People are following me?" I asked quietly. Ethan nodded once. "I believe so. Because of you." He hesitated for the first time since sitting down. "I do not know yet." "That is not the answer you want to give me." "No," he admitted. "It is the most honest answer I have." I folded my hands around my coffee cup, trying to steady them without letting him notice. "You keep telling me only part of the truth." Ethan looked toward the front window, where pedestrians continued passing by without a second glance. "That is because I am still trying to understand which part belongs to me and which part belongs to you." His words only deepened my confusion. "You make everything sound like a puzzle." A faint smile appeared before fading almost immediately. "I wish it were only a puzzle." Silence settled between us. For the first time since we met, I noticed how tired Ethan looked. Not physically exhausted, but emotionally worn in a way that could not be hidden behind tailored suits or calm manners. He had the expression of someone who had spent years carrying responsibilities he could never completely set down. "Tell me one thing," I said softly. "When you answered my message online, was it really because you wanted to help me?" He looked directly into my eyes. "Yes. Nothing else. Nothing else." His answer came so quickly that I believed him without hesitation. Whatever secrets surrounded Ethan, I no longer doubted that first decision. He had come because he genuinely believed someone should answer. Before either of us could continue, the bell above the coffee shop door chimed softly. A man entered wearing a dark jacket and baseball cap. He looked around the room for only a second before walking toward the counter. Ethan's attention shifted almost imperceptibly. To anyone else, it would have seemed like an ordinary glance. I noticed something different. His posture became slightly more alert, though his expression remained completely relaxed. "Do you know him?" I whispered. Ethan did not look away from his coffee. "No." "Then why are you watching him?" "Because he looked at you before he looked at the menu." A chill moved through me. I had not noticed. Ethan had. The man ordered a drink, waited quietly, then left with nothing more than a paper cup. Ethan continued watching through the window until the man disappeared around the corner. Only then did he relax again. "You noticed all that in a few seconds?" I asked. He gave a small nod. "You learn to pay attention when enough people depend on your judgment." There it was again. Another answer that explained everything and nothing at the same time. I took a slow breath. "Ethan, what exactly do people depend on you for?" Before he could answer, his phone vibrated once against the table. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time since we met, the calm certainty in his eyes shifted into unmistakable concern. He looked back at me immediately. "Claire," he said quietly, "I need you to go home right now." "Why?" He slipped the phone back into his pocket without taking his eyes off me. "Because someone just entered your apartment building asking for Noah. Nothing reveals how much someone matters until you believe they might need you before you can reach them." The words hit me with such force that I was already on my feet before I realized I had stood up. "Noah?" I whispered, gripping the edge of the table. "Who is asking for him?" Ethan rose just as calmly, setting a few bills beneath his untouched cup of coffee. "I do not know yet." "Then how do you know someone is there?" He looked at me with the same steady expression that had first convinced me to trust him. "Because I have people watching the building." I stared at him. "You have people watching my apartment?" "After what happened yesterday, yes." I should have been angry. Part of me wanted to be. Instead, all I could think about was Noah sitting alone inside that apartment. Ethan gently motioned toward the door. "We need to leave." I nodded immediately. The late afternoon air felt colder than before as we stepped onto the sidewalk. A black sport utility vehicle was already waiting at the curb. The same driver I had seen outside the Historical Society stepped out and opened the rear passenger door. "Sir," he said quietly. Ethan acknowledged him with a slight nod before turning to me. "Claire, please get in." I hesitated for only a heartbeat before sliding into the back seat. Ethan joined me, and the vehicle pulled smoothly into traffic. There was no speeding, no dramatic urgency. Everything felt remarkably controlled, almost as though every movement had already been planned. I looked toward Ethan. "How far away are we?" "About 12 minutes in normal traffic." "Can we call Noah?" Ethan immediately handed me his phone. "Use mine." I dialed Noah's number with trembling fingers. The call rang once, twice, 3 times. Finally, his cheerful voice answered. "Hey, Claire." Relief rushed through me so quickly that I almost laughed. "Noah, are you okay?" There was a brief pause. "Of course. Why? Has anyone knocked on the door?" "Actually." He sounded uncertain now. "A maintenance worker stopped by about 15 minutes ago asking if everything was working properly in the apartment." I exchanged a quick glance with Ethan. His expression remained unreadable. "Did you let him inside?" "No. You always tell me not to open the door for strangers." I closed my eyes in gratitude. "Good. Listen carefully. Do not answer the door again until I get home." Noah laughed softly. "Claire, you sound like something out of one of those mystery novels you keep recommending. Promise me." The smile disappeared from his voice. "I promise." After the call ended, silence settled inside the vehicle. Outside the windows, the city moved normally. Parents walked with children. Office workers hurried toward train stations. Cyclists crossed busy intersections. The ordinary world continued untouched while mine seemed to be quietly changing with every passing minute. "Your people?" I asked finally. Ethan nodded. "One of them saw a man enter your building carrying a maintenance clipboard. But he was not actually maintenance." "No." "How do you know?" Ethan looked out the window before answering. "Because the building manager never requested maintenance today." I frowned. "How could you possibly know that?" This time he did not answer immediately. The driver caught Ethan's eyes briefly through the rearview mirror before speaking in a respectful tone. "Sir, we have confirmation." Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Go ahead." The identification badge the man was carrying belongs to someone who reported it missing yesterday morning. My heartbeat slowed into a heavy, steady rhythm. I turned toward Ethan once more. Every answer seemed to reveal an even larger question. The man beside me was no ordinary businessman. Whatever world he lived in, information reached him faster than it reached anyone else, and for reasons I still could not understand, he had decided that protecting my family had become his responsibility. You learn everything about a person's character by watching what they do when nobody is asking them to be kind. The sport utility vehicle rolled quietly into the parking lot of my apartment complex, just as the first porch lights began glowing against the evening sky. I reached for the door handle before the vehicle came to a complete stop, but Ethan gently placed a hand on the center console, stopping me for only a second. "Please wait." There was no fear in his voice, only patience. The driver stepped out first and looked calmly around the nearly empty parking lot. Another man I had not noticed before emerged from a second vehicle parked several spaces away. They exchanged a subtle nod before the driver returned to my door and opened it. Everything happened so naturally that it was obvious this was not the first time they had worked together. I stepped onto the pavement, my eyes immediately searching for my apartment window. The lights were on. Relief washed over me. Ethan walked beside me toward the entrance without saying a word. Inside the building, everything looked exactly as it always had. The old mailboxes lined one wall. A faded welcome mat rested near the elevator. Someone had left a bicycle leaning against the staircase. Nothing suggested that anything unusual had happened. Yet Ethan continued observing every corner with quiet attention. When we reached my apartment door, I knocked softly. "Noah?" A second later, the door opened. Noah smiled the moment he saw me. "You made it." Before I could answer, he noticed Ethan standing beside me. "Hi, Ethan." Ethan smiled politely. "Good evening, Noah." Noah looked from one of us to the other. "Okay, I definitely missed part of this story." I laughed for what felt like the first genuine time all day. The sound surprised even me. We stepped inside together. Noah explained that the man claiming to be a maintenance worker had left after only a minute when nobody opened the door. He had never become impatient. He had never tried to force a conversation. He had simply walked away. Ethan listened carefully without interrupting. When Noah finished, Ethan asked only one question. Did he look inside the apartment through the windows before leaving? Noah thought for a moment. No. At least I do not think so. Ethan gave a small nod as though another invisible piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. Thank you. Noah tilted his head slightly. Can I ask you something? Of course. What exactly do you do? I almost apologized for the question. But Ethan simply smiled. I solve problems. Noah laughed. That is even more mysterious than what Claire told me. Ethan looked genuinely amused. I have heard that before. Noah shook his head with a grin. You know, most people would have panicked today. Ethan's expression softened. Panic rarely improves a situation. Neither does pretending everything is fine. Noah replied. Ethan looked at him with quiet respect. That is true. Watching the two of them talk felt strangely natural, as though they had known each other much longer than a few days. Noah treated Ethan like an old friend, and Ethan answered every question with the same patience he had shown me from the very beginning. As Ethan prepared to leave, Noah walked him to the door before suddenly speaking again. Thank you for looking out for my sister. Ethan paused with one hand on the doorknob. She has spent a long time looking out for everyone else. He glanced back toward me. She should not have to do it alone anymore. After the door closed behind him, Noah turned toward me with an expression I knew well. It was the face he made whenever he had already figured something out before I had. Claire, he said quietly, I do not think Ethan is helping us because he feels sorry for us. I think he made a promise to himself long before he ever met us. Sometimes the greatest mystery is not discovering who someone is. It is realizing how much they have already changed your life before you ever learn the truth about them. Long after Noah had gone to bed, I remained sitting beside the living room window, watching the lights of the city shimmer beneath the cool autumn night. Ethan's words echoed through my thoughts. She should not have to do it alone anymore. Nobody had ever said anything like that about me. For years, people had admired how strong I seemed. They thanked me for being responsible. They complimented my determination. No one had ever looked at me and quietly suggested that perhaps I deserved help too. I reached into my wallet and spread everything across the coffee table. My driver's license, a grocery receipt, Ethan's first business card, the handwritten number he had given me that afternoon, Richard Collins's card, 3 ordinary pieces of paper that somehow connected to a story I still could not understand. My phone vibrated softly. I looked down, expecting another bill reminder. Instead, a single text message appeared from Ethan. I wanted you to know that everyone is safe tonight. Sleep well, Claire. There was nothing dramatic about the message. No instructions. No warnings. Just quiet reassurance. I smiled before I even realized I was smiling. My fingers hovered over the screen for several seconds before I finally replied. Thank you. Be honest with me when you can. The typing indicator appeared almost immediately, then disappeared. A full minute passed before another message arrived. I promise. It was only 2 words, yet somehow they carried more weight than long explanations. I locked my phone and rested my head against the back of the couch. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the branches of the maple trees lining the parking lot. Everything looked peaceful again. For the first time in days, the apartment no longer felt like a place balanced on the edge of uncertainty. It felt like home. The following morning began quietly. Noah left early for a follow-up appointment while I prepared for another day at the library. Before leaving, I opened the front door and froze. Resting neatly on the welcome mat was a small paper bag from the neighborhood bakery. Inside were 2 fresh blueberry muffins and 2 cups of coffee, still warm. There was no receipt, no signature. Only a folded note written in careful handwriting. Breakfast is easier when it is shared. I knew immediately who had left it. I looked down the empty hallway, but there was no sign of Ethan or anyone else. I carried the bag inside and laughed softly to myself. Noah looked up from tying his shoes. What is so funny? I handed him one of the muffins. Apparently someone thinks we forget to eat breakfast. Noah examined the note before smiling knowingly. He pays attention. I nodded without realizing it. He did. Not only to the big things, but to the small ones everyone else overlooked. Later that afternoon, as I organized returned books behind the circulation desk, 2 women entered the library chatting excitedly. One of them placed a newspaper on the counter while searching for her library card. A photograph on the front page immediately caught my attention. Several well-known business leaders stood together outside a charity fundraising event. In the center of the photograph stood Ethan Moretti, dressed in the same quiet elegance I had already come to recognize. The headline beneath the picture was simple enough, but one sentence in the article made my breath catch. It described Ethan Moretti as the private head of one of the city's oldest and most influential families, a man whose name carried extraordinary influence in business, politics, and organizations that few outsiders truly understood. I stared at the photograph, suddenly realizing that the stranger who had answered one desperate message online belonged to a world far beyond anything I had ever imagined. And for the first time, I found myself wondering whether the greatest danger was not that someone was following me, but that I had unknowingly stepped into Ethan Moretti's world. End of episode 2. See you in episode 3. The moment you stop fearing the truth is often the moment the truth finally decides to find you. I could not concentrate on a single page for the rest of the afternoon. The newspaper article remained folded beneath the circulation desk, but every sentence I had managed to read echoed through my thoughts. Ethan Moretti belonged to one of the oldest and most influential families in the city. It never called him a criminal. It never called him dangerous. Yet it described a man whose influence reached boardrooms, charities, and organizations that preferred to remain out of public view. I had met him standing in the rain outside my apartment, wearing a soaked overcoat and asking only one question. Was I all right? Those two versions of Ethan refused to fit together. When my shift ended, I did something I had never done before. Instead of waiting for answers to find me, I decided to look for them myself. I walked to the historical society where I had seen him only a day earlier. The old brick building looked exactly as it had before, quiet beneath the fading afternoon light. Visitors wandered through the front garden while volunteers arranged flowers near the entrance. Everything appeared ordinary. I stepped inside and approached the reception desk. A friendly woman looked up from her paperwork. "May I help you?" I smiled politely. I was hoping to learn a little about the Moretti family. I heard they have supported several historical projects here. Her expression brightened immediately. They certainly have. For decades. She pointed toward a hallway lined with framed photographs. The East Gallery includes a permanent exhibit recognizing local families whose donations preserved much of the city's history. I thanked her and slowly walked into the gallery. Portraits covered the walls. Judges, teachers, doctors, philanthropists. Near the center hung a large black and white photograph taken decades earlier. Beneath it, a brass plaque read, "The Moretti Family." I studied the faces one by one. Generations stared back with expressions that carried quiet confidence rather than wealth. Beside the photograph rested a glass display case filled with newspaper clippings describing hospitals, scholarships, libraries, and community centers funded over many years. None of it resembled the rumors people usually attached to powerful families. As I continued reading, an elderly volunteer approached with a warm smile. "Beautiful history, is it not?" I nodded. "Do you know the family?" He chuckled softly. "Only from afar. They have helped this city for longer than I have been alive." "What about Ethan Moretti?" The man's smile softened. "His father served this community the same way before him, and Ethan." He looked thoughtfully toward the old photograph. "He rarely seeks attention. Most people never realize how many scholarships, shelters, and food programs quietly receive his support." I blinked in surprise. That was not the image the mystery surrounding Ethan had encouraged me to imagine. "He sounds different from what people whisper." The volunteer gave a knowing smile. "People often confuse influence with fear. They are not always the same thing." Before I could ask another question, my phone vibrated. It was not Ethan. It was Noah. I answered immediately. "Hey, everything okay?" "Everything is fine," he replied. "I just wanted to tell you something before I forgot." "What is it?" "Someone stopped by the apartment this morning after you left." My heart tightened. "Who?" "Mrs. Dawson from downstairs. She said a gentleman had come by earlier asking if our family needed any help paying medical bills." I frowned. "Did she know who he was?" "She said he never gave his name. He only told her that no family should have to choose between medicine and groceries." My breath caught. I already knew those words. They sounded exactly like something Ethan would say. Yet he had never mentioned sending anyone. For the first time since meeting him, I realized that perhaps the kindest things he did were the ones he never intended me to discover. I have put the requested story text into a reusable writing block. The easiest lies to believe are the ones that ask for nothing in return. I left the historical society carrying more questions than answers, but for the first time those questions no longer frightened me. They pulled me forward. During the bus ride home, I kept thinking about the elderly volunteer's words. People often confuse influence with fear. They're not always the same thing. Until now, I had allowed strangers, newspaper headlines, and mysterious phone calls to shape my opinion of Ethan. Yet every experience I had actually shared with him pointed in a completely different direction. He never demanded trust. He never asked for gratitude. He never reminded me of the things he had done. Somehow that made his kindness feel even more genuine. When I reached the apartment, Noah was sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by insurance forms and medical paperwork. He looked up with a tired smile. "I was hoping you would get home before I lost my mind trying to understand these." I laughed softly and placed my bag on the counter. "You picked the wrong sister if you wanted someone who enjoys paperwork." He slid one of the forms toward me. "At least you can usually figure out what they are trying to say." We spent nearly an hour sorting documents into neat piles, highlighting deadlines and comparing prescription costs. It was not exciting work, but there was something comforting about solving ordinary problems again. For a little while, our lives felt familiar. As the evening grew quieter, I finally asked the question that had been sitting in my mind since Noah's phone call. "Tell me exactly what Mrs. Dawson said this morning." Noah leaned back in his chair. "She said a well-dressed gentleman knocked on her door first instead of ours. He introduced himself politely and asked whether the Bennett family might need help paying for medical expenses. She assumed he worked for a charity. Did she describe him?" Noah thought carefully before answering. "She said he was probably around 60 years old, had gray hair, and carried himself like someone who had spent his whole life being respectful." I slowly nodded. It did not sound like Ethan. It sounded more like someone representing him. "Claire?" Noah asked gently. "Do you think Ethan sent him?" I looked down at the paperwork spread across the table. "I honestly do not know anymore." That answer bothered me more than I expected. I had started this journey believing Ethan was hiding dangerous secrets. Now I was beginning to wonder whether he had simply been hiding acts of kindness because he never wanted recognition for them. My phone rested beside the stack of insurance forms. I looked at the handwritten number Ethan had given me only a day earlier. This time I did not hesitate. I picked up the phone and called. It rang only once before he answered. "Good evening, Claire." His voice sounded warm, almost as though he had expected to hear from me eventually. "I have been asking questions," I admitted. There was a brief silence before he replied. "I assumed you would." "Did you send someone to help my family this morning?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, I heard him exhale quietly. "Mrs. Dawson spoke to you." It was not a question. "She did." Another short silence followed. "I asked an old family friend to check whether you needed assistance," he said at last. I also asked him not to mention my name. "Why?" I whispered. His answer came so gently that it almost broke my heart. "Because kindness stops being kindness the moment it becomes a debt someone feels obligated to repay." I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the simplicity of those words. Before I could thank him, Ethan spoke again, and for the first time since we met, there was unmistakable concern in his voice. "Claire, there is something I need to tell you. I finally learned why people have been asking questions about you, and I'm afraid the answer is more complicated than either of us expected. I have put the requested story text into a reusable writing block. There are moments when one honest answer changes your life more than 100 comforting lies ever could." I held the phone a little tighter, afraid that if I interrupted Ethan, whatever truth he had finally decided to share might disappear with the silence. Noah looked at me from across the kitchen, immediately recognizing the expression on my face. He quietly gathered the insurance papers and stepped into his bedroom, gently closing the door behind him to give me privacy. "I am listening," I whispered. Ethan remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. "Claire, everything I am about to tell you comes from verified information, not assumptions. I wanted to be certain before involving you." His words felt measured, careful, and unlike the mysterious conversations we had shared before. This time he was not avoiding my questions. He was preparing to answer them. "The people asking about you are not investigating your finances or your work at the library," he continued. "They are searching for someone connected to your family's past." I frowned. "My family's past? Yes. That does not make any sense. My parents lived ordinary lives." From everything you knew, they did. I slowly sat down at the kitchen table. Ethan, what are you saying? I am saying there may be something your parents never had the chance to tell you. My thoughts immediately returned to the years before the accident that had taken both of them. My father had worked long hours. My mother had volunteered at community events whenever she could. They paid bills, worried about groceries, and celebrated birthdays with homemade cakes. Nothing about my childhood suggested hidden secrets. There has to be a mistake, I said quietly. There might be, Ethan answered. I hope there is. That is why I have not reached any conclusions yet. His honesty steadied me. He was not presenting theories as facts. He was admitting uncertainty, something powerful people rarely seemed willing to do. What did you actually find? I asked. A name. Whose name? Your father's. I closed my eyes. Hearing those words after so many years still carried unexpected weight. What about him? His name appeared in archived legal correspondence from nearly 30 years ago. I waited, but Ethan did not rush the explanation. The documents were never part of a criminal investigation, he continued. They involved a charitable property trust that was dissolved before it ever became active. I frowned. Why would that matter now? Because someone recently requested access to those old records. My heartbeat slowed into a heavy rhythm. You think whoever requested those files is now looking for me? It is possible. Possible is not the same as certain. Exactly. I found myself smiling faintly despite the tension. You really do choose your words carefully. Ethan laughed quietly. Experience has taught me that certainty is dangerous when the facts are incomplete. That answer sounded more human than anything he had said before. It reminded me that beneath the confidence and influence was a man who understood the cost of making the wrong decision. What should I do? I finally asked. For now, nothing different, he replied. Go to work. Spend time with Noah. Live your life. That sounds impossible after this conversation. I know, his voice softened. But fear has a way of stealing ordinary days before anything has actually happened. I do not want that for you. I looked toward the framed family photograph resting on the bookshelf across the room. My parents smiled back at me exactly as they always had. Loving. Ordinary. Familiar. Yet for the first time, I found myself wondering whether there were chapters of their lives they had protected us from rather than shared with us. Before ending the call, Ethan spoke one final sentence that stayed with me long after the line went quiet. Claire, I am not asking you to trust my past. I am only asking you to judge me by every choice you have personally seen me make. I have put the requested story text into a reusable writing block. The hardest memories to uncover are often the ones hidden inside ordinary places you have stopped noticing. I barely slept after ending the call with Ethan. His words lingered in my mind long after the apartment had fallen silent. Someone had searched for documents connected to my father. Not because he had done something wrong, but because something unfinished from decades ago had suddenly become important again. The thought refused to leave me alone. The next morning, after dropping Noah off at his medical appointment, I drove to the small house where my parents had lived before the accident. It had belonged to my aunt ever since, and she had never changed much beyond repainting the porch and planting new flowers beside the walkway. She greeted me with a warm hug and immediately noticed something weighing on my mind. You have your mother's thinking face, she said with a gentle smile. Whenever she became curious about something, she looked exactly like that. I laughed quietly. I guess I inherited more than I realized. We spent a few minutes talking over coffee before I finally asked the question that had brought me there. Aunt Linda, did Dad ever work on anything besides his regular job? She looked surprised. Why would you ask that? I hesitated. I had promised Ethan I would not involve other people in his investigation, but this question belonged to my family. I have been organizing old papers, I said carefully. It made me realize I know very little about what Mom and Dad were doing before I was born. Linda rested her coffee cup on the table and thought for a long moment. Your father volunteered more than he ever talked about. Volunteered? She nodded. There was a community property trust years ago. A few local families wanted to restore abandoned buildings so they could become affordable housing and neighborhood centers. My heart skipped. It matched what Ethan had mentioned. Did it ever happen? Linda slowly shook her head. No. Funding disappeared. People moved away. Eventually, everyone believed the project had simply faded. Do you remember who else was involved? She smiled apologetically. Only bits and pieces. I was much younger then. She stood and walked toward a hallway closet before returning with a dusty cardboard box. When your parents passed away, I packed whatever papers seemed important. I never had the heart to sort through everything. She placed the box gently on the dining table between us. Inside were old photographs, greeting cards, tax documents, newspaper clippings, and several neatly organized folders. I carefully turned each page until a yellow envelope slipped from the bottom of the stack. My father's handwriting covered the front. Community Trust Correspondence. I looked at Linda in surprise. May I? She smiled softly. They belong to you. I opened the envelope carefully. Most of the documents contained meeting notes, property maps, and handwritten ideas about turning abandoned buildings into libraries, clinics, and youth centers. None of it looked suspicious. It looked hopeful. Then a folded letter caught my attention. It had never been mailed. At the bottom of the page were several signatures from volunteers who had supported the project. One signature immediately stood out. Moretti. Not Ethan. Anthony Moretti. I stared at the name for several seconds before looking back at Linda. Did you ever meet Anthony Moretti? Her expression softened with recognition. Only once. He seemed like a very honorable man. I lowered my eyes to the letter again, suddenly realizing that the connection between my family and Ethan's family had not begun with us. It had begun an entire generation earlier, long before either of us knew the other existed. I have put the requested story text into a reusable writing block. The past has a quiet way of reaching into the present when two unfinished promises were never meant to stay forgotten. I sat in my aunt's living room for nearly an hour after discovering Anthony Moretti's signature. The faded ink connected two families that, by every logical measure, should never have crossed paths again. My father and Ethan's father had once believed in the same dream. They had planned libraries instead of empty buildings, community centers instead of abandoned lots, hope instead of neglect. Somehow that dream had disappeared, leaving only scattered papers inside an old cardboard box. Before leaving, Aunt Linda gently touched my arm. "Take the envelope with you," she said. "Your father always believed unfinished things deserved another chance." I smiled softly. That sounds exactly like him. It does. She hugged me before I stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. During the drive home, I placed the envelope carefully on the passenger seat beside me, glancing toward it more than once at red lights. For the first time since Ethan entered my life, I was carrying something he did not already know. The thought felt strange. Until now, he had always been the one uncovering answers. This time, I had found one myself. When I arrived home, Noah immediately noticed the old envelope in my hands. "Please tell me that is not another stack of insurance paperwork." I laughed. "Much better." We spread the documents across the dining table together. Noah examined the old property maps with genuine curiosity while I organized the letters into chronological order. Near the bottom of the envelope, folded between two meeting notes, I found a small photograph that had been stuck to another page for decades. It showed 6 volunteers standing in front of an unfinished brick building. My father smiled with his arm around another man wearing a dark suit despite the construction site behind them. I did not need anyone to identify him. The resemblance was unmistakable. Anthony Moretti had Ethan's eyes. Noah leaned closer. "That has to be Ethan's father." I nodded slowly. "I think so." On the back of the photograph, my father's handwriting listed the names from left to right. Every face had been identified except one. Beside Anthony Moretti's name, my father had written only 4 words. "The man who believed." I read the sentence twice. It did not sound like a business relationship. It sounded like friendship. My phone rested on the table only a few inches away. I looked at it for several long moments before picking it up. This time I did not call because I needed protection. I called because I had something important to share. Ethan answered almost immediately. "Hello, Claire. I found something today." His voice became noticeably more attentive. "Tell me." "I found documents from the community trust." There was complete silence on the other end. "Ethan," I asked. "I am here." His voice sounded quieter now. "Did you know your father worked with mine?" Another pause followed, longer than any silence we had shared before. Finally, he answered with complete honesty. "No." I blinked in surprise. "You did not know." My father rarely spoke about the years before I joined the family businesses. He passed away before I ever thought to ask the right questions. I looked back at the old photograph resting beneath my hand. For the first time since meeting Ethan, I realized I was holding a piece of his past that even he had never seen. "There is something else," I said softly. I think
I have a photograph you might want to see. Ethan did not answer immediately.
When he finally spoke, there was unmistakable emotion beneath his usually steady voice. Claire, would you allow me to come and see it in person? I have put the requested story text into a reusable writing block. Some meetings are planned by people. Others feel as though they have been waiting for years without anyone realizing it. After ending the call, I carefully returned the photograph to its envelope and placed everything neatly on the dining table. Noah noticed the unusual expression on my face almost immediately. He is coming here, is he not? I nodded. He wants to see the photograph. Noah smiled softly. I think he needs that photograph as much as you do. The apartment suddenly felt different. Not because Ethan was coming, but because for the first time I was inviting him into a part of my family's history instead of asking him to protect my future. I straightened the living room almost without thinking, gathering scattered books, folding the blanket on the couch, and placing the old envelope carefully beside the coffee table. Less than 30 minutes later, there was a gentle knock at the door. It was the same quiet rhythm I remembered from the rainy night when everything had begun. I opened the door. Ethan stood there alone, wearing a dark navy jacket over a simple sweater instead of one of his tailored suits. There was no driver waiting in the hallway, no security team, no formal distance between us. He smiled warmly. Thank you for inviting me. Come in. Noah greeted him with an easy smile from the kitchen. Good timing. I was just making coffee. Ethan laughed softly. Then I chose the perfect moment. The atmosphere inside the apartment felt surprisingly relaxed. Noah disappeared into the kitchen, leaving the two of us beside the dining table where the envelope rested. Ethan looked at it quietly before lifting his eyes toward me. May I? I nodded. He opened the envelope with remarkable care, as though every page inside deserved respect simply because my father had once touched it. When he reached the photograph, everything else seemed to disappear. His fingers stopped moving. His eyes remained fixed on the smiling faces frozen in time decades earlier. I watched his expression change in ways I had never seen before. Calm gave way to surprise. Surprise slowly became recognition. Finally, there was something deeper. Grief softened by gratitude. That is my father, he whispered. I nodded. I thought you would know immediately. He smiled sadly without looking away from the photograph. He looks younger than I remember. His thumb rested gently against the edge of the picture, without ever touching the faces themselves. I have never seen this photograph before. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Noah quietly placed 3 cups of coffee on the table before sitting beside us. He glanced at the photograph and then at Ethan. Your father looks happy. Ethan smiled faintly. He was happiest when he believed people could build something together. I looked down at the handwritten note on the back of the picture. My father called him the man who believed. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. That sounds exactly like Anthony Moretti. For the first time since we met, Ethan began speaking about his father without hesitation. He told us how Anthony believed that influence carried responsibility, that success meant little unless entire neighborhoods benefited from it, and that every opportunity to help someone should remain private whenever possible. As he spoke, I realized I was no longer learning about a powerful family. I was learning about the values that had quietly shaped the man sitting across from me. When Ethan finally reached the last document inside the envelope, a small folded page slipped free and landed on the table. None of us had noticed it before. I carefully unfolded the aging paper. It was a handwritten list of future meeting dates that had never happened. At the bottom, beneath every signature, my father's final sentence stood alone. If anything ever happens to us, someone must finish what we started. Ethan read the words in complete silence. Then he slowly lifted his eyes to meet mine, and without saying a single word, I knew we had both reached exactly the same conclusion. I have put the requested story text into a reusable writing block. The promises that survive the longest are often the ones made by people who never lived to see them fulfilled. None of us spoke for several moments after reading my father's final sentence. The apartment had grown unusually quiet. Even the steady ticking of the old clock on the kitchen wall seemed louder than before. Ethan remained seated, his eyes resting on the faded page, as though he were seeing far more than the words themselves. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. There was no mystery left in it, no carefully measured distance, only honesty. Claire, he said quietly, I owe you the truth. I nodded without speaking. He folded the letter carefully before placing it beside the photograph. Years ago, after my father passed away, I inherited much more than businesses. He paused briefly, searching for the right words. I inherited responsibilities. Some were legal, some were personal. Others belonged to people who trusted my father enough to believe he would always keep his promises. Noah listened silently from across the table. Ethan continued in the same calm voice. For a long time, I believed the community trust had simply failed because circumstances changed. I never knew your father had continued trying to preserve it. He looked toward the handwritten note again. If I had known. His sentence faded unfinished. You would have done something, I said softly. Ethan met my eyes. Immediately. There was no hesitation in his answer. I believed him. Then maybe you are not too late, Noah said quietly. Both of us turned toward him. Noah shrugged with a small smile. The buildings might still exist. The neighborhoods are still there. People still need libraries and clinics. His simple observation settled over the room like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Ethan smiled at him with unmistakable admiration. Your brother has remarkable perspective. I laughed softly. He usually does. Noah leaned forward, pointing toward the old property map spread across the table. If this was their dream, maybe we should find out what happened instead of assuming it disappeared forever. Ethan studied the map thoughtfully. I can locate the original properties through public land records. He stopped himself and smiled apologetically. Legally available records, he added. I could not help laughing. Thank you for clarifying. He smiled back, the tension easing for the first time that evening. It was a small moment, but an important one. We were no longer talking about danger. We were talking about possibility. I realized something then that had never occurred to me before. Since meeting Ethan, nearly every conversation had centered on protecting me. This was different. For the first time, we were working towards something together rather than simply reacting to problems. As the evening grew later, Ethan carefully returned every document to the envelope exactly as he had found it. Before closing the flap, he stopped and reached for the old photograph one final time. He looked at Anthony Moretti's smiling face for several quiet seconds. My father always told me that buildings matter less than the people inside them, he said. I understand now where that belief came from. He slid the photograph back into place and handed the envelope to me instead of keeping it himself. These belong with your family. I accepted it carefully. We can make copies. He nodded. That would be enough. As Ethan prepared to leave, he paused beside the apartment door. Claire, there is one more thing you should know. I looked at him expectantly. The person who requested access to those old trust records did not ask for every document. My heartbeat slowed. What did they ask for? Ethan's expression grew thoughtful once again. Only one file. Which file? He held my gaze for a long moment before answering. The one containing the original list of everyone who believed in the project. I have put the requested story text into a reusable writing block. Sometimes the smallest name on an old piece of paper becomes the reason an entire future begins to change. Ethan's final words stayed with me long after the apartment door closed behind him. The original list of everyone who believed in the project. It sounded ordinary until I remembered everything that had happened over the past week. Someone had searched archived records. Someone had quietly asked questions about my family. Someone had tried to learn who remained connected to a dream that had ended almost 30 years earlier. I stood at the window watching Ethan cross the parking lot. He was alone, carrying nothing except his coat folded over one arm. Before opening his car door, he glanced back toward the apartment building for just a moment. Our eyes met through the window. He gave me a small, reassuring nod before driving away into the evening. There was something different about that goodbye. He was no longer protecting a stranger. We were carrying the same story now. The following morning, I arrived at the library earlier than usual. The quiet building always helped me think clearly. Before opening to visitors, I unlocked the local history room where old newspapers, property maps, and archived city records were stored. Most people never visited that section unless they were researching family history. I suddenly realized I had become one of those people. Mrs. Harper, the senior archivist, smiled when she saw me. You are here before everyone else today. I need a favor, I admitted. I am trying to learn more about a community trust from nearly 30 years ago. Her eyes brightened with professional curiosity. That should be possible. We still have most of the city planning archives. Together we searched through catalog drawers and digital records until she located several oversized archive boxes that had not been opened in years. Dust rose gently into the morning light as we lifted the first lid. Inside were meeting minutes, donation receipts, newspaper advertisements, architectural sketches, and handwritten volunteer lists. Nothing appeared unusual until I noticed several folders labeled missing original documents. Mrs. Harper, I asked quietly, were these records incomplete when they arrived here? She adjusted her glasses before examining the label. No, she frowned thoughtfully. I remember these files. They were complete when they were donated many years ago. My heartbeat quickened. Then why does the box say missing documents? She slowly shook her head. Because someone legally requested access to the collection about 6 months ago. When the materials were returned, several original pages had been replaced with certified copies. I stared at her in surprise. Is that allowed? Normally, yes, she answered. As long as preservation standards are followed and nothing is altered. I looked back at the folders. Do the records show who requested access? She walked toward the computer terminal and searched the archive database for several minutes. Finally, she sighed apologetically. The request came through a law office representing a private client. The client's name was protected under archival privacy rules. It was not the answer I had hoped for, but it was more than I had known yesterday. Someone had been searching long before Ethan ever entered my life. As I carefully returned the folders to the archive box, a folded note slipped from between 2 certified copies and landed quietly on the table. It was not part of the official records. Someone had hidden it there years ago. Mrs. Harper looked surprised. I have never seen that before. I unfolded the small piece of paper with trembling hands. Only one sentence had been written in faded blue ink. If the original list ever disappears, look inside the cornerstone. Beneath the message was a simple sketch of the unfinished community building my father and Anthony Moretti had once hoped to complete. The future sometimes waits inside a stone that everyone else has walked past for years. I carefully folded the hidden note and slipped it into the same envelope that held my father's documents before thanking Mrs. Harper for her help. She promised to continue searching the archive catalog for anything connected to the unfinished community trust. But I already knew where the next answer might be waiting. The cornerstone. During the drive home, I called Ethan. He answered after the first ring. Claire, I found something. I told him about the missing originals, the certified copies, and the handwritten message hidden between the folders. For several seconds, he remained completely silent. Finally, he spoke. That note was never meant for the public archives. You think someone hid it intentionally? Yes. His voice remained calm, but I could hear genuine curiosity beneath it. Claire, do you still have the property map from your father's envelope? I do. Meet me tomorrow morning. Bring every document you found. I want us to compare the original map with current city records before we visit the building. I smiled without realizing it. Us, he answered gently. This stopped being my investigation and became our family's story the moment we discovered our fathers had been working together. That single sentence settled warmly inside me. For the first time since this journey had begun, I no longer felt like someone being protected. I felt like an equal partner searching for the truth. The next morning arrived with bright autumn sunlight and unusually clear skies. Noah insisted on coming downstairs to wish us luck before his ride to physical therapy arrived. He handed me the old envelope with exaggerated care. Do not lose history, he joked. I laughed and hugged him. I will do my best. When I stepped outside, Ethan was already waiting beside a dark gray sport utility vehicle. This time there was no formal driver opening doors. He leaned casually against the vehicle with 2 paper cups of coffee in his hands. Good morning, he said, handing one to me. Blueberry muffin was unavailable today. I smiled. I suppose I will forgive you. He laughed quietly, and for a moment neither of us mentioned investigations, missing records, or mysterious files. We were simply 2 people sharing coffee on a cool morning. During the drive, we spread the old property map across the center console whenever the vehicle was parked safely at traffic lights. Ethan compared landmarks with a current city planning map displayed on a tablet. Suddenly, his fingers stopped moving. The building still exists. I leaned closer. Really? He nodded. It was never demolished. The city converted part of it into a storage facility years ago. My heartbeat quickened. So the cornerstone could still be there. It could. Neither of us spoke for the rest of the drive. Anticipation quietly filled the silence between us. When we finally arrived, the building looked older than it had in my father's photograph, but unmistakably familiar. The unfinished brick walls had weathered decades of changing seasons. Ivy climbed across one side, and faded windows reflected the morning sun. It did not look abandoned. It looked forgotten. Ethan stood beside me, studying the entrance with quiet respect. Our fathers believed this place would become something that served people, he said softly. I nodded. Maybe it still can. We walked slowly toward the front corner of the building, where the original cornerstone remained partially visible beneath years of landscaping. Kneeling beside it, I brushed away loose dirt with my hand, until engraved letters slowly appeared beneath the dust. There, carved into the stone before the building had ever opened, were 6 names. My father's name, Anthony Moretti's name, and 4 others. But directly beneath the list, someone had engraved one final sentence that neither of our fathers had ever mentioned. It read, "This promise belongs to whoever chooses compassion over power." Ethan looked at the words in complete silence before quietly whispering, "Claire, I think we have finally discovered what our fathers were truly trying to protect. ENDOF Episode 3. Episode 4 coming soon." The greatest legacies are not inherited. They are chosen. I could not take my eyes off the words carved into the weathered cornerstone. This promise belongs to whoever chooses compassion over power. The sentence felt less like a message from the past and more like a question waiting for an answer. Ethan remained beside me, quietly studying the worn engraving while a cool breeze carried fallen leaves across the empty lot. Neither of us rushed to speak. After everything we had uncovered during the past few days, silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt respectful. Finally, Ethan broke it. "There is one thing that does not make sense." I looked at him. "The hidden note." He nodded. "Someone expected the original list to disappear years before anyone searched the archives. That means whoever wrote the note understood something the rest of them did not." I glanced back at the cornerstone. "You think one of the original founders hid it?" "Perhaps." He slowly walked around the building, examining the aging brick walls with thoughtful attention instead of urgency, or someone close to them. I followed him toward the front entrance, where faded construction dates remained barely visible above the old doors. A city maintenance sign hung beside the entrance, explaining that the structure was scheduled for future evaluation, but nothing suggested anyone had looked closely at the cornerstone in decades. Ethan removed his phone and made a brief call. He spoke politely, introducing himself not as a businessman but as a representative of the Moretti Family Foundation. After a few minutes, he thanked the person on the other end and ended the call. "What happened?" I asked. "The building is still owned by the city. Can we go inside?" "Not today." His answer carried no frustration. "It has been closed for safety inspections. We will need official permission." I smiled faintly. "That sounds much more responsible than climbing through a broken window." Ethan laughed quietly. "My father would have expected nothing less." We spent another 20 minutes carefully photographing the cornerstone, the surrounding brickwork, and every visible inscription before returning to the vehicle. During the drive, neither of us talked much about hidden messages or missing documents. Instead, Ethan asked me about my parents. He wanted to know what music my father enjoyed, what my mother cooked on birthdays, and whether our family had any traditions that survived after they were gone. At first, the questions surprised me. Then I realized something important. He was not trying to solve an investigation. He was trying to understand the people his own father had once believed in. By the time we reached my apartment, I felt as though I had introduced him to memories instead of evidence. Noah was waiting on the balcony when we arrived. He waved cheerfully before carefully making his way downstairs with the help of his cane. "Please tell me you found something besides another mystery," he joked. I smiled. "Actually, we found both." Ethan showed him the photographs on his phone. Noah studied the engraved sentence for several quiet moments before looking up. "Compassion over power," he repeated. "That does not sound like instructions for hiding money or protecting property." Ethan nodded. "No, it sounds like guidance." Noah smiled thoughtfully. "Maybe everyone has been searching for the wrong treasure." The three of us fell silent. His words settled over the conversation with unexpected clarity. For days we had been chasing names, documents, records, and hidden messages. Yet every clue kept pointing back to the same simple idea: build something that helps people. protect kindness without asking for recognition. Finish what others never had the chance to complete. Ethan slowly slipped his phone back into his pocket before meeting my eyes with quiet determination. Tomorrow morning I am requesting access to the building through the city council. I nodded. And if they approve it, a small smile appeared across his face. Then we stopped searching for what our fathers left behind and finally begin discovering why they believed it was worth protecting in the first place. The strongest doors do not open with force. They open because someone finally asks the right question. The following morning arrived with crisp autumn air and an unusual sense of anticipation. For the first time since Ethan and I had met, we were not reacting to another mystery that had suddenly appeared. We were following a clear path built by people who had walked it long before us. Ethan arrived at the apartment shortly after 9 carrying a slim leather folder instead of the usual stack of business documents. Noah met us at the door with an encouraging smile. "Bring back good news," he said. Ethan smiled warmly. "That is the plan." We drove downtown to City Hall, where the Department of Historical Properties occupied the 3rd floor of an old government building overlooking the river. The waiting area was quiet except for the soft rustling of paperwork and the distant ringing of office telephones. Ethan checked us in without mentioning his family's influence or asking for special treatment. We waited nearly 40 minutes before a middle-aged woman named Susan Parker invited us into her office. She greeted us with professional kindness and listened patiently as Ethan explained our request. He showed her copies of the community trust documents, the old photograph, and the inscription from the cornerstone. I watched carefully as her expression shifted from polite interest to genuine curiosity. "I remember hearing about this project years ago," she admitted. "Most people assumed it simply failed because funding disappeared." Ethan nodded respectfully. "That is what we believed as well." Susan leaned back in her chair. "If you are requesting access to the building for historical research and document preservation, that is entirely different from commercial development." Ethan smiled. "We are not here to purchase anything." I did not think so. She opened several digital records before turning her computer monitor slightly toward us. "The structure has been classified as a protected municipal property for almost 20 years. Limited access can be granted with supervision." Relief spread quietly across my face. "Does that mean we can go inside?" Susan nodded. "Yes. However, there is one condition." Ethan folded his hands calmly. "Of course. Everything discovered inside must first be documented as part of the public historical record before any private organization claims ownership." Ethan answered without hesitation. "That seems entirely appropriate." Susan smiled for the first time. "I had a feeling you would say that." While she prepared the authorization paperwork, she paused unexpectedly. "There is something else you should know." Ethan and I exchanged a quick glance. Susan reached into a filing cabinet and removed a thin archive folder that looked much older than the others. "About 6 months ago, another individual submitted a request to enter the same building." My heartbeat quickened. "Were they approved?" Susan slowly shook her head. "No." "Why not?" I asked. "Because they refused to explain why they wanted access." Ethan remained perfectly still, listening without interruption. Susan continued turning through several pages before stopping at the original application. Oddly enough, they were not interested in the building itself. She tapped one sentence highlighted in yellow. They specifically requested permission to examine the cornerstone. A quiet silence settled across the office. I looked toward Ethan. This time neither of us needed to speculate. Someone else had already followed the same trail months before we ever discovered the hidden note. Susan handed Ethan the signed authorization forms with a reassuring smile. "Your visit has been approved for tomorrow morning." As we stood to leave, she hesitated before adding one final thought. "Whoever submitted that earlier request never came back." Ethan thanked her sincerely before we walked into the hallway together. Only after the office door closed behind us did he speak. "Claire, I do not think we are following someone else's investigation anymore." I looked at him. "What do you think we are following?" His answer came quietly, almost as though he had only just realized it himself. "I think someone expected us to finish it. Hope feels different when it finally has a place to stand." The next morning arrived brighter than any of the days that had led us here. For the first time since everything began with one desperate message, I woke feeling something stronger than uncertainty. I felt purpose. Ethan arrived exactly when he said he would.
A city preservation officer named Daniel Harris was already waiting outside the old community building carrying a clipboard, a ring of heavy keys, and a warm smile that immediately eased the formality of the morning. "Thank you for your patience," Daniel said as he unlocked the front gate. "This building has been closed for years, but structurally it is still sound. Please stay together while we are inside." Ethan thanked him sincerely before stepping aside so I could enter first. Dust floated through beams of morning sunlight pouring across the old wooden floor. The building smelled of aged brick, weathered timber, and decades of quiet. Yet despite the years, nothing inside felt abandoned, it felt paused. Daniel explained that the city had occasionally discussed restoring the property, but every proposal eventually lost funding before construction could begin. As he spoke, I noticed faded pencil markings on one wall listing room dimensions. Beside them, someone had written children's reading room in careful handwriting.
My chest tightened. "Dad," I whispered almost instinctively. Ethan looked toward the words and smiled gently. "Your father dreamed in details." We continued deeper into the building. Every room revealed another forgotten piece of that dream. One area had been planned as a neighborhood clinic. Another carried sketches for evening education classes. A large open hall overlooked what would have become a small public library. None of the ideas centered on profit. Every plan centered on people. Daniel paused near the middle of the building. "There is one room we never opened after the project ended," he explained. "The city sealed it because construction was never completed." He unlocked another door, pushing it open slowly. Inside stood a modest meeting room containing only a long wooden table, several stacked chairs, and a dust-covered chalkboard. Everything had been left exactly as it had been decades earlier. I slowly walked toward the chalkboard. Written across its surface in faded white chalk were 3 simple words: "Finished together always." My eyes immediately filled with emotion. Ethan stood beside me, staring at the message in complete silence. Daniel looked surprised. "I have inspected this building twice before," he admitted. "I never noticed those words." I smiled faintly. "Maybe you were looking at the walls instead of listening to the people who built them." Daniel nodded thoughtfully before quietly stepping outside the room to give us privacy. Ethan carefully brushed a thin layer of dust from the meeting table. Resting near one corner was a small brass nameplate that had fallen onto its side years ago. He picked it up and turned it toward the light. "Anthony Moretti." I found another one beneath a stack of papers. "David Bennett." My father had once sat across this very table from Ethan's father, planning a future they believed would outlive them both. Suddenly the room no longer felt empty. It felt full of unfinished conversations waiting patiently for someone to continue them. Ethan carefully returned both nameplates to the center of the table, exactly where they would have faced one another during those meetings. He looked at me with quiet conviction. "Claire, I finally understand why my father never stopped talking about responsibility." I nodded slowly. "And I finally understand why mine never gave up believing people could change a city without asking for anything in return." As we prepared to leave the room, Daniel called softly from the hallway. "You should probably see this before you go." We stepped outside and found him kneeling beside an old built-in cabinet that had shifted slightly when the room was opened. A narrow compartment had become visible behind it, and tucked neatly inside rested a sealed wooden box with a handwritten label that simply read, "To the ones who chose to come back. The people who leave the greatest gifts behind rarely expect anyone to remember their names." Daniel carefully lifted the small wooden box from the hidden compartment without disturbing the dust that had protected it for decades. He examined the faded label before looking toward Ethan and me. "Since this was discovered during an authorized historical inspection, we should document it before opening it," he explained. Ethan nodded immediately. "That is the correct procedure." Daniel photographed the box from every angle, recorded its location inside the concealed compartment, and entered several notes on his clipboard. Only after completing the official record did he gently place the box on the old meeting table. None of us spoke as he carefully released the worn brass latch. The lid opened with surprising ease, as though it had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. Inside lay several neatly folded letters tied together with a blue ribbon that had faded almost to gray. Resting above them was a leather journal, its cover worn smooth by years of careful handling. Beneath the journal sat a small polished wooden plaque engraved with the words "Community Trust Founders." Daniel looked toward us. "These documents are now part of the city's historical record, but I would like both of you to examine them with me. You understand the context better than anyone." Ethan thanked him sincerely. I reached for the journal first, but stopped when I noticed another inscription pressed into the inside cover. In careful handwriting, someone had written, "If you are reading this, then hope has survived longer than we did." My throat tightened. Ethan quietly opened the first page. Every entry had been dated.
Every meeting had been documented. There were notes about fundraising dinners, volunteer schedules, building permits, and neighborhood surveys. It was not the diary of wealthy businessmen. It was the working notebook of ordinary people determined to build something that would outlive them.
As I slowly turned another page, a familiar name appeared beside a list of completed tasks. David Bennett. My father had organized volunteers for weekend construction. Anthony Moretti had secured donations from local businesses. Other founders had arranged books, medical supplies, and educational programs. Every person contributed something different. Nobody appeared more important than anyone else. Ethan smiled quietly while reading one of the entries. My father wrote very little about himself. I looked over his shoulder. Anthony had written only one sentence beneath an entire page describing everyone else's work. Leadership means making certain every volunteer receives the credit they deserve. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Suddenly, so many things about Ethan made perfect sense. He had never learned humility from success. He had inherited it from his father. Daniel carefully untied the blue ribbon holding the letters together. The first envelope was addressed to future volunteers. The second was addressed to the city council. The third carried no name at all. Instead, it simply read, "Open only when someone chooses compassion over power." Ethan and I exchanged a quiet glance. Neither of us reached for it immediately. Daniel smiled gently. "I believe the inscription on the cornerstone answers that condition." Ethan nodded. "I believe so too." With extraordinary care, Daniel opened the final envelope and unfolded a single handwritten letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained remarkably clear. We leaned closer as he began reading aloud. The letter did not describe hidden money, secret ownership, or forgotten property. Instead, it spoke about responsibility. It explained that the building had never been created to belong to one family, one organization, or one generation. It belonged to every person willing to improve the lives of strangers without expecting recognition. At the bottom of the page, 6 signatures appeared beneath the final sentence. Then I noticed something none of us had expected. Beside every original signature was an empty line, carefully drawn decades earlier, leaving space for names that had not yet been written. Some names are written in ink. Others are earned through the choices people make when no one is watching. None of us spoke after Daniel finished reading the letter aloud. The quiet inside the meeting room felt almost sacred, as though every voice that had once filled the building had returned for a single moment. I looked again at the empty signature lines beneath the founders' names. They had not been forgotten. They had been intentionally left blank, waiting for people the original founders would never live long enough to meet. Daniel carefully placed the letter back onto the table before looking at Ethan and me. "As the city's preservation officer, I cannot decide who signs anything connected to this trust," he said gently. "But I believe I understand why those lines were left empty." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "They were never meant for heirs." Daniel smiled. "No, they were meant for successors." The distinction settled quietly into my heart. Our parents had not expected us to inherit ownership. They had hoped someone would inherit the responsibility to continue serving others. Ethan slowly closed the journal and rested both hands on its worn leather cover. "Claire," he said softly, "my father spent years teaching me that influence only matters when it improves someone else's future. Until today, I thought that lesson came from business. I was wrong. It began here." I looked around the unfinished room once more. The faded chalkboard. The long wooden table. The simple chairs waiting patiently through decades of silence. None of it represented failure anymore. It represented an interrupted beginning. Daniel carefully photographed every page of the journal and every letter before placing them into archival preservation sleeves. His professionalism impressed me. Nothing about the discovery became dramatic or rushed. Every document was treated as a piece of history that belonged to the entire community. Before sealing the wooden box again, he noticed one final folded sheet resting beneath the journal. "There is one more document," he said quietly. We gathered around the table once again. Unlike the previous letters, this page contained no greeting. Instead, it listed practical instructions: annual public financial reports, volunteer leadership elections, community voting requirements, free educational programs, open access to library resources, affordable health services. Every guideline emphasized transparency, shared responsibility, and public accountability. Ethan read each line carefully before smiling with quiet admiration. "This is not a secret society." I laughed softly. "No, it is probably the least secret organization anyone has ever created." Even Daniel chuckled.
The light moment eased the emotion filling the room without breaking its sincerity.
At the bottom of the page appeared one final instruction, written in larger handwriting than everything above it. If this building ever opens its doors again, let the first visitors be children. My eyes immediately filled with tears. I remembered the faded words we had discovered earlier. Children's reading room. My father had not dreamed about monuments. He had dreamed about children walking through these halls carrying books. Ethan remained silent for several moments before speaking with remarkable certainty. That will be the first promise we keep. I looked at him. There was no trace of obligation in his voice, only conviction. Daniel closed the wooden box and secured the preservation seals before carefully carrying it toward the entrance. These materials will be transferred to the city archives this afternoon, he explained. Certified digital copies will also be available for your foundation and for the Bennett family. Ethan thanked him sincerely. As we stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight, I turned back for one last look at the quiet building. It no longer felt abandoned. It felt awake. Ethan stood beside me with his hands resting comfortably in his coat pockets. "Do you know what surprises me most?" he asked. I shook my head. He smiled toward the old brick walls. After everything we uncovered, the greatest treasure was never hidden inside a box. It was hidden inside an idea that was simply waiting for someone to believe in it again. The measure of a promise is not the day it is made. It is the day someone finally chooses to keep it. 3 weeks passed more quickly than I expected. The city completed its documentation of every letter, every journal entry, and every photograph discovered inside the old community building. Historians prepared digital archives, while preservation specialists carefully protected the originals for future generations. During those same weeks, Ethan seemed busier than I had ever seen him, yet somehow he always found time to call Noah after physical therapy, ask how my work at the library was going, or send updates about the restoration process. What surprised me most was that he never spoke about headlines, donations, or public recognition. Every conversation centered on practical questions. How many books should the children's library begin with? Which local organizations already offered after-school tutoring? Could the future clinic partner with nearby hospitals instead of replacing them? The project was becoming real, one careful decision at a time. One afternoon, Ethan invited Noah and me to attend the first public planning meeting at City Hall. I expected a formal presentation led entirely by business leaders and city officials. Instead, I found teachers, nurses, librarians, neighborhood volunteers, local architects, and families filling the meeting room. Daniel Harris greeted everyone warmly before explaining that the community trust would be restored exactly as its founders intended, through cooperation rather than ownership. Susan Parker reviewed the preservation findings while displaying copies of the original journal on a large screen. Every person in the room listened with remarkable attention, not because the story involved influential families, but because it belonged to the city itself. When Daniel finished, he invited public comments. An elderly woman slowly stood near the back of the room. "My father volunteered on that construction site," she said quietly. "He used to tell me that unfinished dreams are only waiting for another generation." Several people smiled with quiet recognition. Then a retired teacher shared memories of collecting donated books for the planned reading room. A local physician explained that his mentor had once hoped to volunteer in the unfinished neighborhood clinic. Story after story filled the room, each one connecting another forgotten thread to the dream our fathers had started decades earlier. I looked toward Ethan. He was listening instead of leading, taking notes instead of giving speeches. That image stayed with me because it reflected exactly what Anthony Moretti had written inside the journal. Leadership means making certain every volunteer receives the credit they deserve. Near the end of the meeting, Daniel invited Ethan to address the audience. Ethan stood slowly, looking around the room before speaking with the same calm honesty that had first earned my trust. "My father believed that influence should always create opportunity for others," he said. "David Bennett believed ordinary neighbors could accomplish extraordinary things together. Neither of them expected statues, buildings named after them, or recognition. They wanted children to have places to learn, families to receive help when they needed it, and communities to grow stronger because people chose compassion over power." The room remained completely silent till he continued. "The Moretti Family Foundation will provide financial support for this restoration, but the community trust will belong to the people it was always created to serve. We are not rebuilding a monument. We are finishing a promise." Applause slowly filled the room, beginning with only a few hands before spreading to everyone present. I glanced toward Noah, who smiled with quiet pride. In that moment, I finally understood why every clue had led us here. None of the hidden messages, missing documents, or forgotten letters had been protecting a secret. They had been protecting an idea strong enough to survive until the right people were willing to carry it forward together. The truest victories are measured by the lives that become brighter long after the applause has ended. 6 months later, the old community building no longer looked forgotten. Fresh brickwork blended carefully with the original walls, preserving every detail that carried the story of the people who had dreamed there decades before. Large windows welcomed sunlight into rooms that had once gathered only dust. Shelves filled the children's reading room with donated books. Volunteers arranged tables inside classrooms where free tutoring programs would soon begin. The small neighborhood clinic was preparing to open with physicians and nurses who had donated their time each week. Every improvement honored the past without trying to erase it. On a cool Saturday morning, the city gathered for the official reopening ceremony. Families filled the front lawn. Children chased one another across the grass, while local musicians played gentle acoustic music beneath colorful banners celebrating the return of the community trust. Reporters attended, but the atmosphere felt remarkably personal. This was not the unveiling of a famous landmark. It was the return of a promise people had quietly carried in their hearts for decades. Noah stood beside me, no longer relying on his cane except during longer walks. Months of therapy had restored much of his strength, and the smile on his face seemed brighter than I had seen since before our parents passed away. "Dad would have loved this," he said softly. I nodded, unable to answer immediately. Across the courtyard, Daniel Harris welcomed visitors into the restored building, while Susan Parker introduced a historical exhibit displaying copies of the founder's journal, photographs, and letters. Every visitor paused before the enlarged image of Anthony Moretti, standing beside my father in front of the unfinished construction site. Children asked questions. Parents shared memories. Grandparents recognized familiar faces. The story no longer belonged only to Ethan and me. It belonged to everyone willing to remember. When the ceremony officially began, the mayor thanked the volunteers, preservation staff, teachers, librarians, healthcare workers, donors, and neighborhood residents before inviting Ethan to the podium. He walked forward without prepared notes, looking first toward the restored building instead of the audience. "Many people believe buildings change communities," he began. "I think communities change buildings." A quiet smile spread across the crowd. Nearly 30 years ago, ordinary people imagined a place where children could discover books, families could receive care, and neighbors could help one another without asking for recognition. Their work stopped before their dream was complete, but their purpose never disappeared. It simply waited for another generation to continue it. He turned toward me briefly before continuing. "Claire Bennett reminded me that history is not something we inherit. It is something we choose to honor through our actions. Her family protected this promise. My family helped rediscover it. This city brought it back to life." The applause that followed felt warm rather than overwhelming. Ethan stepped away from the podium and motioned for me to join him. Surprised, I walked forward as he smiled encouragingly. "There is one tradition we have not completed yet," he said quietly. Daniel approached carrying the framed founder's charter containing the original 6 signatures and the empty lines we had discovered months earlier. "The charter was never waiting for owners," Daniel explained to the audience. "It was waiting for caretakers." Ethan accepted the pen first but paused before signing. Instead, he handed it to me. "Our fathers began this together," he said softly enough that only those closest could hear. "It feels right that you write the first new name." My hands trembled slightly as I signed beneath the founder's signatures. Ethan signed beside mine immediately afterward. Neither signature represented authority. They represented responsibility. Looking around at the children already exploring the reading room through the open windows, I realized our names would someday become part of someone else's history. And for the first time in a very long while, that future no longer felt uncertain. It felt wonderfully possible. The most meaningful endings rarely feel like endings at all. They feel like the quiet beginning of everything that comes next. The weeks following the reopening transformed the old community trust building into exactly what our parents had imagined decades earlier. Every afternoon, children filled the reading room with laughter as volunteers helped them discover stories hidden inside books instead of forgotten archives. The classrooms hosted free tutoring sessions led by retired teachers and college students. Families visited the neighborhood clinic knowing they would always be welcomed with dignity and respect. The building had finally become alive because people had chosen to fill it with kindness instead of simply restoring its walls. One Saturday morning, I arrived early to organize a literacy program before the first families arrived. Sunlight streamed through the large front windows, illuminating rows of colorful books that had once existed only as sketches inside my father's journal. I paused beside the framed founder's photograph displayed near the entrance. Anthony Moretti and David Bennett still smiled at one another across nearly 30 years of history. But now the picture no longer represented unfinished dreams. It represented promises fulfilled. A little girl no older than 8 walked into the library holding her mother's hand. She stopped in front of the photograph and looked up at me with innocent curiosity. "Who are those people?" she asked. I smiled warmly. They were friends who believed every child deserved a place like this. She studied the picture for another moment before asking, "Did they build it?" I glanced around the bright reading room filled with volunteers unpacking new books. "They started building it," I answered gently. "A lot of other people finished it." She smiled as though that answer made perfect sense before running toward a shelf filled with adventure stories. I watched her disappear between the rows of books and realized that she would probably never know how many lives had quietly come together to create that ordinary Saturday morning. Somehow, that made the moment even more beautiful. Later that afternoon, Ethan stopped by carrying 2 cardboard boxes filled with newly donated children's books from the Moretti Family Foundation. He set them carefully beside the circulation desk before looking around the room with quiet satisfaction. "I was hoping it would sound like this," he admitted. I listened. Soft conversations, children laughing, pages turning, teachers encouraging nervous readers. It sounded wonderfully ordinary. "What did you expect?" I asked. He smiled. "My father used to say that the healthiest community is usually the quietest one because people are too busy helping each other to make noise about themselves." I laughed softly. That sounds exactly like him. Ethan looked toward the founder's photograph hanging on the wall. "I spent years trying to honor my father's memory by protecting everything he built." He turned back toward me with gentle honesty. "You taught me that the best way to honor him was to finish what he could not." Before I could answer, Noah walked into the reading room carrying a stack of volunteer applications. His physical therapy had progressed so well that he now volunteered 3 afternoons each week helping younger students with mathematics. "Looks like we need more shelves," he announced cheerfully. Ethan looked toward the growing collection of donated books before smiling. "That sounds like the kind of problem our fathers would have enjoyed solving." We all laughed together. It was a simple conversation, but I suddenly realized how much our lives had changed. Months earlier, we had been strangers connected only by fear and unanswered questions. Now we were surrounded by neighbors, volunteers, children, teachers, and families whose futures had quietly become part of our own. Standing in the middle of that room, I finally understood something my parents had known all along. A person's greatest legacy is never the life they build for themselves. It is the hope they leave behind for someone else to carry forward. The most extraordinary stories rarely end with the people who lived them. They continue through the lives those people quietly changed forever. Nearly a year passed before I truly understood how much our journey had transformed not only Ethan and me, but everyone connected to the community trust. The children's reading room became the busiest place in the building every afternoon. Families gathered for health workshops in rooms that had once existed only as pencil sketches inside an old journal. Volunteers greeted one another by name because strangers had gradually become neighbors. Every corner of the building carried evidence that compassion, when practiced consistently, could become something permanent. One autumn evening, after the last visitors had gone home, I remained inside the reading room organizing returned books. Outside, golden sunlight settled across the restored brick walls, making them glow with the same warmth I had imagined when I first discovered my father's papers. Ethan walked quietly through the front entrance carrying nothing except 2 cups of coffee. He smiled when he saw me. "I thought you might still be here." I accepted the cup with a grateful smile. "You know me too well." We wandered slowly through the empty building together. The clinic lights had already been turned off. The classroom stood ready for another day of learning. Children's drawings decorated the hallway walls, replacing the faded construction sketches that had once covered those same spaces. Ethan paused beneath the founder's photograph. "Do you ever think about how unlikely all of this was?" he asked. I looked at the familiar faces smiling from another generation. "Every day." He nodded thoughtfully. One message asking for help. One rainy night. One decision to answer instead of walking away. I laughed softly. And one librarian who refused to stop asking questions. He smiled. "I am very grateful she did." We continued walking until we reached the cornerstone outside the entrance. The engraved words remained exactly as they had been on the day we first discovered them. "This promise belongs to whoever chooses compassion over power." Visitors often stopped to read the inscription before entering the building. Children sometimes traced the letters with curious fingers, asking their parents what the words meant. I had learned there was no single answer. The meaning revealed itself through the people who walked beyond that stone and chose to serve someone besides themselves. A familiar voice called from behind us. Noah stepped outside carrying a small cardboard box. "I thought you too might want to see this." He handed it to me with an unmistakable smile. Inside rested dozens of handwritten notes, folded into colorful shapes by children who visited the reading room every week. One by one, we unfolded them together. "Thank you for helping me love books. Thank you for fixing this place. I want to help people when I grow up. I like coming here because everyone smiles." Some notes contained only simple drawings of books, trees, families, and bright windows. Others carried careful handwriting from children, still learning to form each letter. Every message reminded me that our fathers had never been building walls. They had been building opportunities for moments exactly like these. Ethan quietly placed the notes back into the box before looking toward the entrance one final time. "Anthony used to tell me that power disappears when people stop believing in you," he said. "But kindness keeps working long after you are gone." I slipped my hand gently into his. My father believed almost the same thing. We stood there together as evening settled across the neighborhood. The building behind us remained filled with books, hope, and quiet laughter waiting for tomorrow morning. It no longer belonged to unfinished dreams, hidden records, or forgotten promises. It belonged to every child who opened a book for the first time, every volunteer who chose to help without expecting recognition, every family who walked through its doors believing tomorrow could be better than yesterday. Looking back now, I finally understand that the night my cry for help reached Ethan Moretti did not rescue only one frightened woman. It reunited two families, fulfilled a promise made decades earlier, and proved that the greatest legacy anyone can leave behind is not power, wealth, or influence. It is the courage to answer someone else's call for help, and trust that one act of compassion can change far more lives than we will ever have the chance to see.